China, the Middle Kingdom, had been one of the mightiest powers in the world for centuries. Their hegemony led to its isolation from most geopolitical developments and world politics. After all, China lacked no products within its borders, according to the Qianlong Emperor. When the British Empire demanded trading rights, a contemptuous refusal was all that was given. The Chinese would soon be strong-armed into allowing Western powers to trade on their territory, however. And all this happened during two wars that became known as the Opium Wars. The early stages of the 19th century had been tumultuous for China. The White Lotus Rebellion waged over provinces in central China. As for its international relations, they consisted of tributary states that assumed a subordinate role to the empire. When the British Macartney expedition reached China, Macartney himself was rather surprised the Chinese emperor refused all their requests, such as trade and exchanging diplomatic contacts. Aside from this different take on international relations, the industrialized West far superseded China in terms of industrial and military power. There was an enormous discrepancy in power relations of which China was not yet aware. It was during this time the British started shipping opium from British-controlled India into China. Unable to directly trade with China, Western powers were forced into a separate trading area, the 13 factories, outside of Canton, and had to rely on Chinese middlemen that charged high taxes. Thing is, tea, porcelain, and silk were goods sold with an enormous profit in Europe. As such, trade continued, though the situation was far from ideal. Now, opium was traded for China's silver currency, leading to the outflow and drain of silver from the country. It had a rather negative effect on China's currency system, resulting in hardship on all levels of the population. While opium trade and usage was banned several times, the Brits simply started smuggling opium into the country. There was a movement in China that voiced their support for the legalization of opium. If legalized, the Qing could levy tariffs and taxes on it, they reasoned. This movement was opposed by the Beijing court, however. When in 1934 British Lord Napier arrived in Canton as the first superintendent of trade, one of many misunderstandings arose. He refused to trade via Chinese middlemen, instead demanding relations with the Chinese Governor-General. Chinese officials were forbidden from holding relations with foreigners, however. Traditional system and all. When refused, Napier forced his fleet up to Canton. He passed away of malaria before fighting seriously escalated, but his death postponed war by only a few years. Cooperation between the governments remained impossible, as suppressing opium trade and smuggling didn't work out. The Qing instated more rigorous measures such as the death penalty for both users and smugglers. All the while, tensions kept rising. The conditions under which the Qing allowed Western trade in Canton slowly became more problematic for Britain. But for China too, the situation remained extremely negative. Silver flowed out of the country at an incredible pace. In 1839, the Qing government sent the imperial envoy Lin Zexu to Canton. He was authorized by the Daoguang emperor to put a halt to opium trade. Known for being incorruptible and efficient, he seemed like the perfect man for the job. He even sent a letter to Queen Victoria in which he wrote, "Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly you would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused." I feel that this letter properly describes the opium trade in China. Lin wanted to root out the opium importers and distributors in Canton. He proved very able to do so. Initially not willing to use force, much less to provoke war, British merchants resisted, and Lin saw it necessary to isolate them in their 13 factories. They were forced to rescind their opium stock, which Lin publicly destroyed. Lin certainly was efficient. He secured over 20,000 chests of opium, but his treatment of British citizens was seen as a crime against the London government and Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The Chinese did not fully realize how their course of action would be perceived. British merchants demanded compensation. The British government pointed to the Qing as those that had to pay up. Lord Palmerston, the British Minister of Foreign Affairs, was initially unsympathetic to British merchants not abiding to Chinese law. He changed his opinion in 1839 and now started advocating for British trading rights. Tensions worsened further when a drunken English sailor killed a Chinese citizen in Canton. The British refused to have him tried under Chinese law. The case was symbolic for the two different perceptions of international relations. All the while, Lin continued the cleanse of the Guangdong province. Addicts and dealers were arrested, and the price of opium skyrocketed. When news of opium seizure reached England, Parliament voted to take retaliatory action. Wealthy opium merchants such as William Jordan even returned to England to advocate their cause. Though Parliament was angry, war was not officially declared. British warships under Admiral George Elliot's command from the Indian Squadron appeared in China's Pearl River in June 1840. By then, there had already been skirmishes between Brits and Chinese at Hong Kong. Local population in Canton and Hong Kong poisoned wells and refused to sell food to the British troops. Chinese soldiers, braves, and junks were mobilized. Instead of attacking Chinese fortifications, Elliot's fleet simply blocked the harbor and sailed their force north, blocking other harbors along the way. Sailing along the coast, the British eventually reached the Dagu forts, where serious negotiations with Qishan, Governor-General of the region, were undertaken. While Qishan was initially praised by the emperor for his negotiation tactics, within half a year he would be sentenced to death, as it became clear the British didn't adhere to Chinese demands. On the British side, PM Lord Palmerston was equally furious with Elliot, replacing him with Sir Henry Pottinger. All the while, fighting on the Chinese coast and countryside continued. Often led by Chinese gentry, militants attacked the Brits. These would retaliate by virtually annihilating garrisons, fortresses, junks, and occupying parts of Canton. With less than 7,000 armed troops, the British managed to beat the Qing both on sea and land. It was their technological and naval superiority that made the Qing barely a match for them. The Qing's military backwardness became evident on land, as the bannermen that fought the British troops were often scrambled together groups of undisciplined soldiers. In August 1841, Pottinger sailed north once again and seized multiple ports. He decided to force the Qing to capitulate by cutting off China's main river and seizing Shanghai and Zhejiang. Local officials were afraid to report the extreme defeats, and as such the emperor received fabricated reports of victories over the British. But when the expeditionary force conquered Chushan Island south of Shanghai, it became clear that Lin had failed his task. He was dismissed in disgrace. It wasn't difficult for the Brits to amass victory over victory. The amount of casualties by the end of the war shows this all too clear. There were under 1,000 British casualties, while the Chinese suffered around 20,000. They now started to wonder how to capitalize on their overwhelming military power. After all, they weren't eager to gain more territory in China. They simply wanted to be able to use the country as their foreign market. Open it up, so to speak. Eventually, British forces started to close in on Nanjing, China's second largest city. Pottinger refused to negotiate with the Qing until they agreed to a complete deal. Eventually, the Qing gave in. They had to give in if it wanted to continue its rule over the Chinese people, retain some form of domestic stability, and maintain its mandate of heaven. When the Treaty of Nanjing was signed by Qi, all demands by the British were met. Ironically, the reason this war started, opium, was not mentioned at all. To begin with, the Qing conceded Hong Kong, which would become a British stronghold in China. Furthermore, Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Fuzhou, and Ningpo were the first treaty ports open to foreign trade. China was only allowed to raise extremely low tariffs, which could not be altered. British merchants were not subjected to Chinese law, but to British law, as long as they traded within the treaty port. Britain was acknowledged as a diplomatic equal, and lastly, the most favored nations clause was implemented. This meant all privileges other powers enjoyed in China, the Brits now automatically would enjoy as well. An indemnity to pay for confiscated opium and war reparation had to be paid. Other Western powers now hurried to the table to force similar treaties upon the Qing. In short, an entire system of treaties was signed, referred to as unequal treaties in Chinese historiography. The British Supplementary Treaty, American Treaty, and French Treaty followed in the years after the Nanjing Treaty. These treaties and Western powers gaining a foothold in China, undermining the traditional power, eventually led to a second set of wars and treaties in the late 1850s. Shortly after the Peace of Nanjing, tensions again arose. After all, the Qing accepted the peace terms with much reluctance. The Treaty of Nanjing was considered a temporary setback, and the most favored nation clause was considered a way to pit the Western powers against each other. Opium trade expanded along the Chinese coast. During the 1850s, opium import rose to between 50 and 60,000 chests a year, double that of the 1830s. Opium addiction increased and silver kept flowing out of the country. In 1851, the anti-Western Xianfeng emperor ascended to the throne. He was faced with the deadliest civil war the world had ever seen, the Taiping Rebellion, and concurrent Yuan and Muslim rebellions. Now, although the rebellion spread, foreign trade in tea, silk, and opium increased. When the provisions of the Nanjing Treaty came up for debate in 1854, the emperor refused to concede any more treaty ports nor should Westerners be allowed to move freely within China. Allowing foreign diplomats in Beijing was completely out of the question. In treaty ports themselves, Westerners were continuously subjected to anti-foreign sentiment, unstable tariffs, and corruption. The assassination of a French missionary and the disregarding of a British flag on a Chinese vessel named Arrow provided the pretext to once again wage war against China. And as such, the French too were dragged into the conflict. French and British naval fleets sailed onto Canton, and without too much trouble the port was captured and a puppet government was installed in the city. In 1858, the Qing quickly sued for peace. Accompanying the British and French delegation were American and Russian plenipotentiaries. These secured near identical treaties for their own countries. One of the treaty terms stated that Qing had to allow foreign diplomats to stay in Beijing. Considering this would uproot the entire traditional system of tributary states, the Qing became hesitant. They decided not to concede this point, although it had been agreed to in drafts. When British and French ministers wanted to enter Beijing, they were refused passage. British warships were sunk out of nowhere, and the delegations were repelled from the capital, for now. In 1860, a year later, the French and British returned with a vengeance. Outmatching the Qing troops under Prince Senge Rinchen in both technology and numbers, the bannermen were quickly defeated. Beijing was captured and the emperor fled to Yehou. British negotiator Lord Elgin was subsequently arrested during negotiations, even though he flew a flag of truce. 20 of his men were executed. As a reprisal, once he was released, Elgin made sure to burn down the emperor's summer palace. Prince Gong, now the main Chinese negotiator, agreed to a treaty encompassing all those demands of 1858. This treaty is considered the official opening of the Chinese Empire to the Western world. Foreign privileges had been increased and trade would soon blossom for the West. These Western powers would play a big role in the next couple of decades of Chinese history, and Prince Gong too played an important role in Chinese politics, most notably as a proponent of the self-strengthening movement. In 1858, the import of opium was legalized, yet ever since 1839 there barely were any obstacles imposed by the Chinese to its import. It was not until the last phase of the Qing in 1906 that laws were implemented to object opium usage and trade. Actual effective combating had been in place since 1949, over a century after the First Opium War. As the French and Brits waged war against China, the Taiping Rebellion, the deadliest civil war the world had ever seen, broke out. These concurrent events were testament to the dire instability the Qing dynasty found itself in during these years. After the Second Opium War, a movement propagating Chinese reform led by Prince Gong was launched. This self-strengthening movement was opposed by hardline conservatives in Chinese politics led by Empress Dowager Cixi. For a little under 14 years, the Taiping Rebellion waged over China. 17 provinces were ravaged, and the estimated loss of life is between 20 and 25 million. It is the deadliest civil war, one of the deadliest wars ever, and the largest conflict of the 19th century. The Qing dynasty, however, was not only faced with the Taiping Rebellion during this time, but with several other rebellions throughout the country and the Second Opium War. It is one of the bloodiest episodes in Chinese history, which really says something. And this raises an interesting question. How did the Qing manage to stay in power during this carnage? The First Opium War between China and the United Kingdom waged from 1839 to 1842. The result was the humiliating Treaty of Nanking, which did not mention opium, the primary cause of the war, at all. The Second Opium War, or the Arrow War, broke out after the United Kingdom and France had won the Crimean War in the European theater against Russia. This meant they could concentrate their troops in the Far East and once again wage war against China. In 1860, the French and British forces reached and overtook Beijing, China's capital, upon which the Xinhai Emperor fled to Yehou. All this will be delved into in a video about these wars, but it is important to note this took place during the Taiping Rebellion. This already gives an idea of the chaotic situation within China. Well, in 1851, in southern China, the Guangxi province, to be exact, a rebellion under Heng Xiuquan broke out. It would become known as the Taiping Rebellion. Many reasons and causes can be given for the outbreak of this rebellion, with one of the major ones being the horrible conditions the peasantry was living in. The quality of life in rural China during this age, and basically up until far into the next century, was abhorrent. And why did it break out in the south? Well, It was a lost territory consolidated under the Qing dynasty and was located furthest away from the capital. The area was notorious for its secretive sects with anti-dynastic convictions. Furthermore, China's defeat during the First Opium War had severely tainted the prestige of the dynasty, especially in the south, as the majority of the war had taken place there. One of the concessions after the war was that China had to open ports other than Canton, in turn leading to large unemployment around this area, as harbors such as Shanghai were closer to the silk and tea producing areas. Now, one last reason was pirates. After 1842, Chinese pirates were driven inland by the British Navy after a campaign of pirate suppression. All these elements were a poisonous cocktail that was very likely to end up in a rebellion. But a rebellion of this magnitude? Nobody had foreseen that. Let's figure out what the roots of this Taiping movement were. China had a history with rebellions driven by an ideological force, such as Buddhism, for example, the White Lotus Rebellion, or secret societies that adhered to a folk Taoist ideology. The Taiping Rebellion was unique as it had a Christian impulse. There had been European Protestant missionaries active on the southern Chinese coast for several decades, and among others, their preaching reached a village school teacher in Guangxi by the name of Hung Xiuchuan, a member of the minority Hakka people. Hung had failed the Chinese state exams 4 times, heavily influenced by a poorly understood Christian tractatus. It is said he became delusional. During one of these episodes, he had visions that convinced him he was the new Messiah. In conclusion, he logically realized he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. These tracts that influenced Hung were written by Liang Fa, and Hung decided to base his religion on the Old rather than the New Testament. This in turn created a more militant ideology, which adhered to the 10 Commandments but not the Sermon on the Mount. In short, he created his own justification. Alright, so Hung Xiuchuan had a charismatic personality and he convinced several people to follow him, as he was still convinced he was Jesus' younger brother. A distant cousin of his, Feng Yuxian, created the God Worshipper Society based on Hung's idea of Christianity. This cult quickly grew as more disaffected people were recruited over the years. Peasants, pirates, triad members, and Hakkas, it didn't matter. Then in 1850, armed resistance against government troops broke out. Small skirmishes occurred until eventually in 1851, the Yinqiang armed revolt was the first major success of the Taiping. Taiping forces routed forces loyal to the Qing dynasty. It marked the official beginning of the Taiping Rebellion, and as you do when you rout imperial forces, Hung declared himself Heavenly King of the Heavenly Kingdom of Eternal Peace, Taiping Tiankuo. What would follow was the deadliest civil war ever. So much for eternal peace. As Hung declared his heavenly kingdom, the cult saw it as its goal to establish its own empire with Hung at its head. The rebellion quickly expanded and gained momentum, killing and recruiting thousands on its path. The bands of peasants and rebels quickly transformed into over 1 million disciplined, extremely zealous warriors, with strict moral restrictions upon which we will touch later. The organization of the army was elaborate and strict. Indoctrination occurred to such a degree that many times Taiping troops chose death, even suicide over capture. Several Chinese southern provinces were taken over in record tempo, and eventually even Nanking, the second city of China, only behind Beijing, was captured in 1853. Nanking's name was changed to Tianjin, or Heavenly Capital. Now ruling southern China, Hung felt rather confident and sent a northern expedition towards the Qing capital, Beijing. While this expedition failed, it did manage to penetrate Tianjin, another important city, before it was forced to retreat. The Taiping Empire consolidated itself amidst the Yangtze River, and several more attempts to capture the rich agricultural grounds of Yunnan failed. The philosophy of the Taiping rebels was a mixture of old Confucian and new Christian elements. Puritanism was very present, as prostitution, opium, and gambling were prohibited on their territory. Its followers were inspired by its dogmatic and Puritan worldview. The Taipings offered an ideological and societal alternative to being a peasant. Hung Xiuchuan considered a proper way of carrying out his divine task of repenting demons by destroying traditional Buddhist, Taoist temples and Confucianist ancestor tablets. This magnitude and severity of iconoclasm is never seen before in China. Aside from the slaughter, Thousands, if not tens of thousands, of ancient Chinese temples and other relics were destroyed. The Taiping was revolutionary in another sense as well: women's emancipation. The century-old practice of foot binding was outlawed, and women could even serve in the army as officers. And there were plenty of women that did serve. Considering the Taiping had forces that numbered in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, if even a fraction was female, it was already more than armies generally employed during this time. Private property was abolished, and land was distributed between families that were clustered as religious, military, and political units. All of this was only put into practice at a small scale, as the Taiping grip over their conquered territories wasn't too tight due to their lack of cadres. Especially the gentry, which would have supplied the Taiping with educated leaders, was scared by the revolutionary doctrines and practices. One could argue that this is where one of the main reasons lie for the eventual demise of the Taiping. Now, as a historical footnote, a little under 100 years later, Mao's communists consolidated their power over China. The Taiping served as an example of a precursor of the eventual communist revolution because of their primitive style communism and resistance towards the gentry and any old religious and ideological sentiments. The jealousy of several military commanders of the Taiping proved fatal. Young Qing, the Machiavellian commander-in-chief of the Taiping, pretended he went into trances during which he spoke with the Holy Trinity. While Hung claimed to be the Son of God, he did not fake these kind of experiences. Young being the most influential commander of the Taiping, he was a real threat to Hung. In 1856, Young challenged Hung's leadership, demanding a title only reserved for the emperor. Hung tasked his king of the north, Wei Chonghui, to assassinate Young. Wei did so, together with the general Qing, but in the process he massacred Young's family too and thousands of his followers. Well, Hung felt it was only right to assassinate Wei after this complete onslaught. Another general, Shikai, grew worrisome and decided to take his followers, leave Nanjing, and cut ties with Hung. The rest of the Taiping generals were quick to fall as intrigues and conspiracies managed to really thin out the military command of the movement. It left Hung with subpar relatives and loyalists to lead the army and govern the provinces of the kingdom. The kingdom would last for another 8 years, mainly thanks to the military genius Li Sucheng governing the Taiping troops at the lower Yangtze. Now, the Qing weren't just sitting idly by during this time. Zheng Fan was tasked with reorganizing the imperial army. He organized the Hunan army, which became a powerhouse within the Qing military establishment, but loyal primarily to Zheng. This meant its military control became decentralized, and this Hunan army will play a role again during the period of warlordism, over 60 years later. For now, Zheng tasked his young disciple Li Hongchang to build up the Anhui army in order to support his Hunan army. Raising tribute and grain from territories around the Yangtze, he was properly financed, bought Western arms, and increased the army size to 70,000. It was the largest professional standing army serving the imperial government. The Taiping kingdom was crumbling, and its soldiers were pushed back more and more. The incentive to purchase Western arms was given by the victory against the Taiping of the so-called ever-victorious army under the American Frederick Townsend Ward. As the Taiping forces came closer to the outskirts of Shanghai in 1862, this small Western army defended the treaty port and repelled the Taiping. After Ward's death that same year, British Major Charles Chinese Gordon took over command. Chinese troops were recruited into the force, and the Sino-Foreign army captured Suzhou, while a similar Franco-Chinese force captured Hangzhou. Basically, the Taiping were locked in Nanjing at this point. Nanjing was surrounded by Zheng Fan's younger brother by 1862, and the siege would last for over 2 years, but the city was eventually captured without any foreign assistance. As for the leaders of the once mighty Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, Hung committed suicide a month before the city fell. But, well, that's one version of the story. Another one is that food supplies ran low and he ate weeds. He ate weeds and fell ill, which resulted in his death. Okay. Sporadic Taiping uprisings would continue to occur throughout the region for the next 4 years. Interestingly enough, the commander Li Fuzhong, leading Shidakai's army, was defeated in 1871. 7 years after Hung's death. You can see some branches lasted for a while, and it underlined the lack of control Qing forces had in some regions. Nevertheless, in essence, Hung's suicide meant the bloody and brutal end of the Taiping Rebellion. The armies under Zheng did the bulk of the fighting, and the Qing dynasty was saved by its loyal bureaucratic machine and army commanders. What I find rather fascinating about the time period of the Taiping Rebellion is that as the Taiping Rebellion was waging over the Chinese mainland, in other areas massive rebellions broke out as well, completely separate from the Taiping. One of the most dangerous of those rebellions was the Yuan Rebellion in northern China. It was inspired by the White Lotus sect, with the direct reason for the outbreak being the poor socio-economic situation of the peasants and the flooding of the Yellow River. These rebels defeated the Qing troops from their fortified villages, and the rebellion would wage on until 1868 and caused over 100,000 deaths and an economic collapse of the region. In several other areas, Muslim population of China revolted against the Han Chinese and Manchu-led Qing dynasty. The Pantai Rebellion, known in China as the Du and Shu Rebellion, broke out in 1856 and lasted for 17 years. Over 2 million people died during this bloody revolt. The Dungan Revolt broke out in 1862 under the leadership of Yaqub Beg, in which a Muslim minority in western China faced the troops of the Qing dynasty. It is estimated over 17 million people died during this war. Famine, disease, and atrocities from both sides being the main causes, just like the Taiping Rebellion. These mid-century rebellions were crushed without Western participation, although many Western arms were used. You're probably wondering how the Qing managed to stay in power with massive rebellions going on in virtually every province. Fairbank and Reischauer are right that the monopolization of administrative talent played a central role. Those that knew how to govern the Chinese Empire were loyal to the tradition of scholar governments and, more importantly, preferred the Manchu Qing dynasty instead of a group of revolutionary rebels. Tseng and Li furthermore appointed their own supporters to important positions within the bureaucratic machine. The Qing would never regain control over all of China after the disastrous Taiping Rebellion. A period of self-strengthening followed in which the Qing attempted to regain control over the country. The Qing would manage to stay in power for several more decades, but these several decades saw an increase in Western encroachment, rebellions, and wars, with both Western powers and the new rising Asian power, Japan. If that sounds interesting, consider subscribing to my channel, as I'll be making a video series on that. Thank you for watching this video, and what is a person or event from Chinese history that you would like to know more about, and perhaps see a video of? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. See you next time. If you're anything like me and your focus hasn't been on Asian history, you may have vaguely heard of the First Sino-Japanese War. The aftermath of the war ushered in a new era for China, Japan, and the presence of European powers in Asia, as the balance of power shifted. But what's fascinating is that the war was fought over the Korean peninsula, and there were so many power dynamics, intricacies, and conflicting political interests going on that it makes for a fascinating story to analyze the geopolitical situation of Korea in combination with the Japanese and Chinese Empire, the decades preceding this war. Without further ado, I present you a modest overview of Sino-Korean relations combined with Japan pursuing its own interests in the region, all leading up to the Sino-Japanese War. When Japan was opened up by Matthew Perry's notorious gunboat diplomacy in 1854, the country had embarked on an entirely different path than China. This push from the outside had caused a large-scale revolution and a successful attempt to restore the practical abilities and consolidate the political system under the Emperor of Japan, Meiji, in 1868. A group of modern reformers such as Kido Takayoshi and Mori Arinori issued a policy of modernization and westernization. This movement was much stronger than the Chinese self-strengthening movement, which took place around the same time. The goal of the reformers was to develop a modern education system and a powerful military apparatus. Most importantly, however, was a large-scale industrial modernization, which was financed through taxes from the agrarian sector. The first confrontation any country had with modernized Japan was China, when it got into a dispute with Japan over Korea. Now, Japan and Korea had a history going back centuries. One of the most telling events was that at the end of the 16th century, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the second great unifier of Japan, invaded Korea. After all, from Japan's viewpoint, Korea was seen as either a bridge to the mainland or the spear that could penetrate Japan's heart. The northern part of Korea had been incorporated in the Chinese Han Empire ages ago. In 108 before Christ, Pyongyang housed the Chinese commandery, which remained an outpost for over 4 centuries. It wasn't until the 7th century that Korea was unified. Its culture was more or less modeled after China. Whereas Vietnam was influenced by Southeast Asian cultural elements, Korea adopted all of its major features from Chinese culture. As such, it became China's foremost tributary state, regardless of the language and historical difference, not to mention the vigorous sense of their separate identity. Combine these with cultural aspects, a very deeply rooted urge of political conservatism that was prevalent in Korean society. This political conservatism can be seen in the 2 dynasties that ruled Korea in its history. The Goryeo dynasty that reunified Korea back in 935. This dynasty lasted for 474 years, and its successor, the Joseon dynasty, which lasted from 1392 to 1910, a period that is nearly as long as the Chinese Ming and Qing dynasties combined. Fate had it that Korea's geography wasn't a real advantage to the peninsula. It lay at the crossroads where China, Japan, and Russia met and clashed multiple times. The Chinese imperial system and tributary system put its mark on Korea. For hundreds of years, the only foreign interaction Korea had was sending tribute to China, and very rarely to Japan. Virtually every Korean king was hostile to European explorers, just like the Chinese and Japanese, by the way. Japan and China eventually caved in to the European powers, which did not happen by diplomatic means. Well, gunboat diplomatic means. Korea was dubbed the Hermit Kingdom for adhering to their policy of seclusion, until it nearly was too late for them to participate in diplomacy at all. We'll leap to the 1860s, when the Korean state was met by both domestic and foreign challenges. Both China and Japan had faced similar challenges years previously. We'll start with the religious element, as Catholic Christianity reached Korea via the Jesuits of Beijing. These writings became known as Western learning. Smuggled across the border, Catholics and its missionaries were persecuted in Korea. It was coined a foreign menace and heterodox sect. Automatically, Christianity became an underground society, and Chinese and French priests were smuggled into the country. In response, around the 1860s, the religious cult known as Tongzhi, also known as Eastern learning, was established and violently arose against Western learning, all the while borrowing some of its concepts. The poverty-stricken peasantry was fascinated by this new religious sect, and many joined it. As a result, the cult spread rapidly. They supported uprisings in the south and southeast of Korea, such as the massive Imsul peasant revolt and Yepilyas revolt. The rulers of Korea responded exactly the way you'd expect the Hermit Kingdom to respond to these domestic problems and Western influences. Christianity was banished even more, and a policy of seclusion was instated. Tongzhi was suppressed, and a rigorous program of conservative reforms to counter the hardships the Joseon dynasty faced was pursued by Taewon-gun, or Grand Prince, the father of the boy king Gojong. And as such, the Hermit Kingdom remained exactly that, vigorously exclusionist. Li Hongzhong, the Chinese general that was instrumental in defeating the Taiping, maintained his focus on the ever-growing threat of Japanese power. The Korean peninsula could easily be a liability for China if Japan grew too influential. Korea adhered to its nickname and restricted any contact other than Japanese trade at Busan on a restricted basis, which was somewhat comparable to the Dutch trade at Nagasaki centuries before. The only consistent foreign contact the Korean kingdom had was the annual tribute conducted at Beijing throughout the 19th century. Western vessels occasionally visited the Korean coast due to the bad weather conditions, shipwrecks, and general misfortune. These were subsequently expelled to China. All forms of contact were violently opposed, whether it was trade or negotiation. Among the European powers, this included a certain rivalry. Who would open the Korean peninsula the way Commodore Perry had opened Japan several years before? Multiple missions were sent, often violent, causing plenty of Korean casualties, but the kingdom didn't budge. Meanwhile, several disgruntled Japanese samurai attempted to provoke a war with Korea. In 1873, these plans were thwarted by a less aggressive lobby within the Japanese government. But nonetheless, opening up Korea and draw it away from China was high on Tokyo's list. Eventually, however, this wasn't done through force. In 1875, 5 Japanese warships were fired upon from Korea. Tokyo opposed an invasion of Korea as retribution. It instead attempted to open Korea peacefully. Li Hongchang adhered to the old Sino-centric concept of Chinese moral suzerainty, but respecting the self-governing ability of Korea over its domestic and foreign policy. He did advise Korea to start negotiations with Japan, and in 1876 the Treaty of Ganghwa, an unequal treaty modeled after the treaties the West closed with China and Japan, opened 3 ports to Japanese trade: Pusan, Incheon, then known as Chemulpo, and Wonsan. The treaty referred to Korea as an independent state, and China, having difficulty to translate the ancient tributary relationships to modern ones, did not object. But that did not mean that China did not attempt to keep Korea under its control. The Qing imperial government, realizing opening up Korea may have been detrimental to Sino-Korean relations, attempted to keep Korea under Chinese control. Li Hongchang urged Korea to embark on a self-strengthening policy, not just modeled after the Chinese one, but controlled by the Chinese. The moderate Chinese reform program was competing with the more profound modernizing influences of Japan. The Koreans could choose moderate and incremental reforms like China, or fast-paced modernization like Japan. Now, there was a third way to make it even more complicated. Both the Chinese and Japanese ways of modernization were opposed by the fundamentalist conservatives like Tae-won-gun. Although King Gojong dismissed him in 1873, Tae-won-gun played a large role in inciting anti-foreign sentiment on the peninsula. This anti-foreign sentiment culminated in 1882. During an uprising, soldiers and a mob set a Japanese government building on fire and attacked the Japanese legation. Shocked at the violent outburst, both Japan and China sent troops to the peninsula in order to restore control. The uprising was swiftly crushed by foreign forces, and Korea had to pay Japan indemnity. Both Japan and China agreed to withdraw their troops from the peninsula. That wasn't everything, though, as China too saw that the conservatives were the reason for opposition to Korean modernization. On the way out of the country, they took something with them. They took Tae-won-gun, who was locked up and held in China for 3 years. Now, the pro-Chinese Min faction at Korean court, represented by King Gojong's queen, was able to gain influence, and a Chinese-oriented policy followed. The self-strengthening of Korea, modeled on the Chinese movement and indirectly overseen by China, wasn't completely altruistic. Li Hongchang tried to combine Korea's self-strengthening with China's building up its navy and army, get a bit of profit out of it. Furthermore, in order to prevent Korea from being absorbed by Russian or Japanese encroachment, he persuaded the country to accept treaties with all trading ports. He figured, and not wrongly might I add, that vested interest in Korea as an independent trading partner would prevent war. The first success was the negotiation between Korea and the United States, which Li Hongzhang brokered. Commodore R.W. Schufeld agreed to the Treaty of Tientsin in 1882. Well, Li Hongzhang acted as a middleman of sorts. It is very ironic to consider he failed to get a clause in the treaty that marked Korea as a dependent state of the Chinese Empire. The US treaty, as a matter of fact, recognized Korea as an independent state, and other European powers that agreed to treaties with Korea would explicitly note its independence the years to come. These diplomatic relations backfired for China, to put it mildly. Tae-won-gun was still residing in a Chinese prison, and his enemies controlled the Korean court. The Min family, represented by the wife of King Gojong, Queen Min, cooperated with China. The conservative policies he instated were structurally dismantled. Chinese influence in Seoul became more prevalent during the 80s, but at the same time, so did the number of Western and Japanese diplomats and missionaries that espoused Korean independence. The main factor was Japan. Japan actively instilled the idea of patriotism and advocated Korean independence, Western ideas of nationalism and reform. It was Japanese liberals such as Fukuzawa Yukichi that advised young Korean reformers like Kim Ok-kyun and Park Yong-yo. The ruling Min faction and Chinese presence vehemently opposed any voices demanding Western-style reforms. As the camp of Western reformers grew, these contradictions eventually culminated in the 1884 Gapsin coup. Plans were made to assassinate Chinese-oriented ministers and kidnap King Gojong. Thing is, this wasn't just Korean coup plotters. The Japanese legation was fully aware of these plans. Even more than that, after the king was abducted by Kim Il-sung and his conspirators, he was put under guard by the Japanese legation guards. Although the conspirators had the support of Japan, the coup failed thanks to the Chinese general Yuan Shikai, who was in Korea to train new Korean military units. His troops defeated the guards of the Japanese legation and rescued the king. A diplomatic crisis, understandably, followed. The crisis was eventually overcome when Li Hongchang and the Japanese statesman Ito Hirobumi signed the Li-Ito Convention. In it was agreed that both China and Japan could only send troops to Korea if they had informed each other about this beforehand. This convention marked the end of Korea as China's tribute state, and this convention will be extremely important in order to understand the Sino-Japanese War. Oh, and Yuan Shikai? He became the Chinese resident general in Seoul in 1885, training Korean troops and meddling in domestic politics for the years to come. A pro-Japanese reform movement was growing during these years, facing the Min faction at court that favored China. Now, remember the religious sect I talked about, the Tongzhi? As all these events we just talked about transpired, the general misery of the Korean population simmered on. It wasn't sustainable and would eventually culminate in the Tongzhi Rebellion. That Tongzhi Rebellion was the direct reason for the Sino-Japanese War, but that's a story I'll tell you next week. Thank you for watching this video, and what is a person or event from Chinese, Korean, or Japanese history that you would like to know more about and perhaps see a video of? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. See you next time. The once mighty Imperial China had faced enormous hardships by the 1860s. The Taiping Rebellion, 2 Opium Wars, multiple concurrent rebellions, and several devastating natural disasters. The country was backward in terms of military compared to Western powers. Fortunately, several important commanders were aware that China was in need of modernization, marking the beginning of the self-strengthening movement under Prince Gong. The mother of the young Tongzhi emperor, Empress Dowager Tongzhi, was an arch-conservative, however, and would slowly but surely go further and further in her attempts to obstruct reforms, even as far as murder. After the French and British occupied Beijing in 1860, the Qing dynasty stood with its back against the wall. In several areas in China, the realization that reform was necessary became apparent. The Manchu Prince Gong, brother of the Qianfeng Emperor, signed the peace treaty with Western powers, ending the Second Opium War. A year later, in 1861, the Qianfeng Emperor passed away. He was succeeded by his 5-year-old son, Tongzhi, whose mother, the Empress Dowager Tongzhi, accepted regency after launching a coup together with Prince Gong and Empress Dowager Xian. Tongzhi would be the main figure in Chinese politics until her death in 1908. Shortly before the fall of the Qing dynasty. For now, Tongzhi, a staunch conservative, was obliged to accept certain reforms Prince Gong advocated. After all, he helped her ascend to the regency and the throne, albeit indirectly. Under young Emperor Tongzhi, there was an attempt at dynastic restoration. In combination with Qing victory over the Taiping, Nian, and Muslim rebellions, the Qing managed to restore a certain degree of the bureaucracy, prosperity, and restrain rural unrest, the primary reasons for those rebellions. Magistrates and gentry ensured depopulated areas were habituated again thanks to the governmental decrees ensuring tax reductions for those that moved there. Irrigation networks vital to Chinese agrarian life were restored and waterworks were erected. Taxes on agrarian products were reduced, if not abolished altogether. The government certainly made an attempt to restore the facilities that had been lost during the rebellions and wars. Most importantly, the Zhongli Yamen was established, something that resembled a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Why did China not have an institution such as this one before? Well, because it considered itself the center of the world. It didn't need to enter into relations with other countries. Other countries simply had to subject themselves and pay tribute to China. The Qing dynasty lost bits of influence in provinces thanks to the gentry and magistrates standing at the forefront of the restoration. Furthermore, the armies that were created to crush rebellions, such as the Yunnan and Anhui army, would continue to exist, with its leaders, most notably Zheng Guofan and Li Hongchang, becoming very powerful individuals. Men that had acquired influential positions sought to find the root of the reasons China had suffered defeats those past years. Not surprisingly, many looked at the military superiority of the West, or barbarians, as many Chinese referred to Europeans. Zhang Guofan, Li Hongjiang, and Zhou Cuntang attempted to get the country on par with the West when it came to military prowess, the so-called self-strengthening movement, and it wasn't aspiring to pursue far-reaching reforms in Chinese society. On the contrary, it wanted to modernize its military in order to protect its society and culture against Western influence, using the barbarians to control the barbarians. Now, during the Taiping Rebellion, military leaders such as the aforementioned men had already started to arm troops with Western weaponry. These developments were now taken further, not just arming forces on land, but modeling a naval fleet after the Western model and constructing modern arsenals and armament factories. Indeed, by the mid-1870s, China was manufacturing thousands of small arms in terms of quality. These were comparable to the arms Europeans were using. All these modernization efforts were made on the basis of the input of Western advisors. Most commanders wanted to get rid of these expensive and often incompetent Western advisors. A project to establish schools educating Chinese in Western languages and science was launched. International law was taught as well, in order for the next generation of diplomats to be capable of beating Western powers at their own game. Zhang Guofan once said, "We should carefully watch and learn their superior techniques and also observe their shortcomings. If they abandon good relations and break their covenant, we would then have the weapons to oppose them." He of course referred to the Western powers. Ingenious ways to handle foreign relations and collect custom dues, build modern ships and weaponry, and to start teaching international law were explored. The rudiments of modern science were established. Self-strengthening took off in a hopeful direction. Perhaps the future of China was more secure than it had been. Though rural areas still marked by tax evasion and corrupt holders of power, the Qing was regaining some of its former strength. It would certainly benefit the dynasty if it could ensure forceful imperial leadership and a resolute Grand Council. Young scholars were even sent to the United States and Europe to study the state systems, industrial technology, military tactics, and progress in science. During these years, the American Civil War was waging on, just to give a small idea of the time frame we're talking about. These types of reforms had unintended consequences, however. Those students that did return began advocating radical forms of educational reforms. China, of course, had the traditional state exam system to educate bureaucrats in service of the Qing dynasty. Now, these students were advocating for reform in all kinds of subjects, from chemistry and mathematics to foreign languages. Conservative Confucian scholars were afraid for the loss of traditional values in Chinese society. The most important opponent of these reforms was the Empress Dowager Cixi, regent of the emperor, and she would attempt to undermine Prince Gong at every turn. Unfortunately for the Qing, any real forceful leadership remained absent. Tongzhi passed away in 1875 at the age of 19. The boy had recently become of age and thus did not need a regent anymore. Though the official cause of death was noted as smallpox, historians believe his mother, Cixi, played a role. Supporting this hypothesis is the suicide of the pregnant empress shortly after, with many historians believing she was driven to suicide by Cixi. Murdering those that opposed Cixi's will would remain a pattern throughout her career, and Tongzhi wouldn't be the last emperor she would allegedly kill. Cixi could only stay in power if she continued her role as regent, and as such, the 3-year-old nephew of the Tongzhi emperor, Guangxu, was appointed with Cixi as his regent. Against Chinese tradition, Guangxu was of the same generation as Tongzhi instead of a generation after. Doesn't seem that important, though nevertheless, Cixi silenced opposition, though one upright Confucian official committed suicide outside Tongzhi's tomb to protest Cixi's decision. When it came to policy, especially foreign policy and reform, Cixi clashed badly with Prince Gong. At one point, Gong ordered the execution of one of Cixi's eunuchs. Cixi was personally offended. It is interesting to note that one of the reasons for the collapse of the Ming dynasty before the Qing was the domination of court by eunuchs. Gong may have been trying to prevent this, nevertheless, he would not hold any position of power for a long time. As for the powerful provincial statesmen, Zheng Guofan passed away in 1872, Wang Xiang in 1876, and Zhe Zongtang remained preoccupied with the Muslim rebellions on China's periphery. The men residing in Beijing generally were conservative, not very eager to reform China. Now, self-strengthening programs were initiated in China still, but a disproportionate amount of these programs were initiated by one man, Li Hongchang. Both Governor-General and Commissioner of Trading Ports Tzu trusted him. He was, besides Tzu, perhaps the most important figure in China during the last decades of the 19th century. He sought to diversify China's enterprise into areas that would have long-range effects on the country's overall development. The feudal and traditional Chinese society was modernizing in some aspects, albeit slowly. The biggest weakness of the self-strengthening movement was in the modesty of its goals. No matter whether it was during the early stages of military modernization or later on, when schools with a Western curriculum were established, these modernization elements were always on the fringe. At most, they were curious old beings in a very traditional society. China's traditional exam system was a big hurdle for self-strengthening. Confucian scholars had access to the bureaucracy, basically the only way to climb up the social hierarchy for many Chinese. The movement wasn't properly guided by the Qing court. By Qing court I mean Tzu, as she practically reigned by herself after Prince Gong was sidelined. Nevertheless, she was faced with the increased independence of provincial governors. The tangible execution of the self-strengthening movement, more often than not, was very dependent on the amount of conflict between subordinate, often rival, authorities. Every attempt at modernization that was successfully implemented was constantly endangered by the corruption of the bureaucracy. Tzu was no less guilty of this either. One of the most notorious cases was the Northern Baiyang fleet. Funny story. The goal was set during the 1880s to modernize the outdated fleet, allocating an enormous amount of funds to it. When the Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1894, it turned out this fleet was neglected. It was completely destroyed, and it was barely a match for the Japanese fleet. When tracing the funds that were allocated to the fleet, it turned out Empress Dowager Tzu and her courtiers had spent most of the money on the rebuilding of the Summer Palace in the Forbidden City, destroyed by European powers during the Second Opium War, over 3 decades earlier. There were more of these instances of type of corruption, in essence crippling China's modernization. Lastly, but certainly not least, was the aversion towards self-strengthening. China's society was still very much conservative, even when it came to the military. This can be seen decades later, even during the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer sect refused to fight with guns, much preferring sticks and swords, considered more traditional. As you can see, there was a rift between conservatives and modest reformers. These would clash many times until the downfall of the Qing 50 years later. In this video, I've attempted to briefly summarize the trends that were going on in China after it faced one of its deadliest episodes. As we can see, Empress Dowager Tzu cemented her power in a ruthless manner, and we've seen that Li Hongzhang was the primary figure instigating reforms, though modest in several areas once Prince Gong was gotten rid of. Next video will be all about the Sino-Japanese War, which will make horribly clear that China's modernization program was insufficient, to put it mildly. If you're wondering what transpired during the last decades of China's once mighty Qing dynasty, consider checking out the playlist on the screen right now, covering the history of both China and the Qing dynasty from the Taiping Rebellion all the way to the Qing's eventual downfall in the 20th century. It covers all wars, rebellions, and political developments in between. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Throughout most history, Japan has been heavily influenced by China in terms of culture, philosophy, law, just to name a few. Well, this all changed after the Meiji Restoration, when Japan came to see China as old and weak against Western powers. Back in 1894, the small power of Japan faced the colossal Chinese Empire in the Sino-Japanese War. Fought over the Korean peninsula, this war would be the ultimate test between the two powers and their respective modernization projects. And trust me, it was an absolute steamroll campaign for one side of the conflict. During the 1880s, the bond between Japan and Korea's Chosun dynasty worsened as Korea leaned more and more towards its conservatism. In 1894, the pro-Japanese Korean leader Kim Il-sung, who was involved with the Gapsin coup a decade previous, was assassinated in Shanghai. The aftermath was a bit of a grisly affair, as authorities in Shanghai decided laws against extradition did not apply to corpses. His body was subsequently shipped to Korea and paraded around its provinces, serving as an example of what would happen to those that dared support Japanese influence. Just to give you an impression of the domestic hostility between the pro-Chinese and pro-Japanese camps. There even was a senior post created by the Qing in Seoul, held by Yuan Shikai, furthering Chinese presence on the peninsula. Yuan's primary objective was to uphold China's privileged status in Korea and ensure that Japan did not gain a foothold. After all, historically speaking, Korea was China's most important tributary state. Throughout the 90s, Japan's influence on the peninsula became more prevalent and tensions kept rising, and then the Tongzhi peasant revolution broke out and swept over Korea. This revolt, induced by a religious sect, was a direct threat to the Korean monarchy and its King Gojong. Now, Tongzhi was a sect that opposed anything westernized, and the uprising started as such, anti-Japanese and anti-Western in its aim, but it quickly deteriorated into an all-out civil war. Several areas of Korea became rebel-controlled and the rebels advanced onto Seoul. The government of King Gojong, rather frightened, immediately requested military aid from their ally, the Qing dynasty. The Qing sent around 2,700 soldiers to the peninsula in order to protect the royal family. Now, if you've watched my video about the geopolitical situation preceding the Sino-Japanese War, you might remember that 10 years ago, an event very similar to this one occurred on the peninsula, namely the Gapsin coup. Both China and Japan sent troops to the Korean peninsula following this failed coup, but they eventually agreed that both countries had to withdraw all their troops. They were only allowed to send their troops to Korea if they notified the other party first. Seems like a clear agreement, right? Well, the Qing sent their troops without notifying Japan, violating this Tientsin Treaty. When Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi got wind of this, he called a special meeting. There it was decided Japan would send a much larger force, the Oshima Composite Brigade. Japan was able to mobilize and transport troops at a fast pace, rendering China's time advantage useless. Around 4,000 Japanese troops landed in Korea in early June, only 2 days after the Qing troops landed. Skirmishes erupted around the countryside, though nothing too serious yet, and the Japanese troops managed to quickly move up to Seoul, Korea's capital. And the Taiping Rebellion? The reason China and Japan sent their troops to Korea? Well, it was rather quickly suppressed by a mixture of Korean and Qing troops under Yuan Shikai's command. That wasn't the end of the fighting, though. Actually, it was just the beginning. The Japanese commander in Korea, Otori Keisuke, received explicit orders to remain in Korea for as long as possible. Liu Zhang, the prominent Chinese statesman, attempted to resolve the conflict with diplomacy, but to no avail. When King Gojong was presented with a list of reforms by the Japanese troops in Korea, he instead demanded the Japanese withdraw their force from Korea altogether. It would take less than a month for the Japanese to decide to seize King Gojong, after he had refused to carry out reforms multiple more times. Japanese troops seized the Korean palace in Seoul on the 21st of July and installed a regent loyal to their interests. Officially, it was only the 1st of August 1894 that Japan declared war on China. That did not mean there was an absence of skirmishes and hostility, however. The First Sino-Japanese War would be the absolute test regarding the results of the Chinese self-strengthening movement and Japanese modernization. It makes an interesting case for the comparative analysis between both countries, both embarking on their respective modernization projects. On the 25th of July, the first naval battle of Pungdo was fought. The Japanese Naniwa, under the command of Captain Togo Hayachiro, sunk 3 ships and caused over 1,000 casualties. The amount of casualties had something to do with the Japanese refusal to rescue the Chinese sailors after their ship was sunk. 4 days later, the Battle of Asan was fought on Korean soil. It was the first overseas battle Japan had fought in over 300 years. Japan was once again victorious, although the majority of Chinese soldiers managed to escape and meet up with the rest of the Chinese army at Pyongyang. Meanwhile, soldiers from both sides were still pouring on the peninsula. China had dispatched over 20,000 Chinese soldiers into Korea, and the Japanese, under General Aritomo Yamagata, had landed on Incheon with their goals to speed through the Korean land. On the 16th of September, the two armies met at Pyongyang for the first time since the official declaration of war. The Japanese attacked Pyongyang from several directions, overrunning the Chinese defenders under General Ye Zichao. The Chinese suffered very heavy losses compared to the Japanese, 500 to 7,000 casualties. Qing forces were decisively defeated in a series of battles around Seoul and Pyongyang. The Japanese were able to advance northward. Not much later, they again met Qing forces at the Battle of the Yalu River. Japan emerged victorious once again, now officially entering Qing territory. It had been a steamroll campaign no one had expected, with Qing forces suffering defeat after defeat. Yamagata's first army crossed the Yalu River undetected during the night, routing Chinese guards on outposts in Manchuria. While part of Yamagata's army under General Katsura Taro pursued the routed Chinese forces, the other part under General Nozu Michitsura advanced towards the city of Mukden. While Yamagata asserted his dominance in northern Korea, a second army corps under Oyama Iwao landed on the Liaodong Peninsula, capturing the last strongholds of the Chinese army and laying siege on Lushunkao, better known as Port Arthur. Within 4 weeks it was captured. What followed was the infamous Port Arthur massacre, where Japanese soldiers wreaked havoc on citizens and soldiers still residing in the port. Though difficult to calculate the amount of Chinese slaughtered, it is estimated these number in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. In effect, it meant that Japan had asserted its complete control over Korean territory within 2 months. Japan's land forces could now enter China proper. Well, the Qing government was pestered by extreme institutional corruption. What transpired with its fleet makes that all too clear. The Japanese fleet under Ito Sukiyuki and Tsuboi Kozo faced the Chinese Beiyang fleet under Admiral Ding Ruchang and Liu Bushan. The Beiyang fleet was in a dreadful condition due to extreme corruption among its leadership. Consisting of at least 2 battleships, 10 cruisers and 2 torpedo boats, it had faced a Japanese assault at the Yalu River in September. Suffering losses, though no extremely mortal wounds, the fleet retreated to the heavily fortified port of Weiwei. There, the fleet would lay dormant behind a curtain of protective mines, not participating in any battles. It ensured the Japanese gained control over the Yellow Sea and boosted the morale of Japanese troops and the home front even more. It also severely upset the balance of power in the region, in China and internationally, and inspired a rivalry among imperialist powers competing to encroach on China's periphery. The Beiyang fleet lay dormant in the port of Weiwei, but on land, the Qing forces were beaten back by the advancing Japanese. The land forces retreated to Weiwei as well, but, according to Jonathan Spence, surprised by the rapid advancement by the Japanese, they were outflanked by a brilliant maneuver of Japanese forces on land and by the fleet under Admiral Ito Sukiyuki. The siege of Weiwei followed, in which the Japanese suffered minor losses, although a Japanese Major General, Odera Yasuzumi, did die during the fighting. After 23 days of sieging, the Japanese forces seized the Weiwei defensive forts from the landward side. As Japanese troops entered the town of Weiwei, several Chinese sailors mutinied. The Chinese Admiral Ding Ruchang took his own life, together with his deputy Liu Bushan and the senior Qing commandants of the forts, turning the guns on the Chinese fleet whilst penetrating the minefields with torpedo boats. The Japanese destroyed whatever was left over of the Beiyang fleet, although, admittedly, this was barely anything. The Battle of Weiwei was the last major battle of the war. China simply did not have a fleet anymore. They truly suffered defeat upon defeat. It was total chaos. Peace negotiations were instigated. Throughout the negotiations, there were several skirmishes between Japanese and Chinese troops, although none noteworthy. China truly was a beaten nation. On the 17th of April, 1895, China could do nothing but sign the peace treaty of Shimonoseki. The disgraced Prince Gang was approached by the Qing court, just as he had 35 years before after the Second Opium War, when the Summer Palace had been burned. He is noted as lamenting to a Western diplomat that he had been given the job of piecing together the cup, which the present ministers have smashed to the floor. I don't think he was too wrong about that. Assisting Prince Gong was Liu Hongzhang, sent as a Chinese envoy to Japan tasked with signing the treaty acknowledging the independence of Korea. Korea instantly became a de facto Japanese protectorate. Now, this Treaty of Shimonoseki was absolutely disastrous for China. It is interesting to note that these terms would have been even worse had a Japanese assassin not shot at Lee while he was negotiating the treaty in Japan. Aside from Korea's independence, it ceded, in perpetuity, the Pescadores, Taiwan, which now would remain a colony of Japan until 1945, and the Liaodong Peninsula of southern Manchuria. China had to pay an indemnity of 200 million silver taels and grant Japan commercial and industrial privileges on its territory, a right that was only reserved for European powers up until now. It had to open 4 ports and allow Japanese to manufacture locally in China. Japan suddenly gained access to an enormous market and could invest even more capital into the modernization of its industries. Due to the shift in the balance of power, Russia feared for its sphere of influence because Japan suddenly gained the Liaodong Peninsula, harboring the very strategically located Port Arthur. Russia had set its own eyes on the peninsula and it managed to get Germany and France to support its protests. Together, they managed to force Japan to relinquish its claim. Under this triple intervention, Japan's arm was twisted into retroceding the Liaodong Peninsula back to China. Port Arthur would be the crucial port during the Russo-Japanese War 10 years later, but for now would cost China an additional 30 million silver taels. In order to pay off these debts, China had to borrow money from a foreign power against terrible rates. Russia got Russian and French banks to loan China about half of the amount required to pay its indemnity to Japan. A year later, in 1896, Russia managed to get a concession from the Chinese to build the Trans-Siberian Railway through Manchuria to Vladivostok, which was more efficient than building it through Russia's own territory. The fact that China allowed Russia to build a railroad through Manchuria would have far-reaching consequences, however. In the end, the Sino-Japanese War and China's humiliating defeat marked the dark conclusion of China's hopeful attempt at self-strengthening. After Russia gained permission to build their Trans-Siberian Railway across Manchuria, they negotiated a secret Russo-Chinese Treaty of Alliance, also known as the Lee-Lobanov Treaty. In short, this meant both countries had to come to each other's aid in case of Japanese aggression. Well, a year later, Russia took it upon themselves to send a naval squadron into Port Arthur, and in 1898 they received a 25-year lease for the entire Liaodong Peninsula, which would be vital during the Russo-Japanese War, only 7 years away. They basically abused their newfound alliance with China. The Qing dynasty's weakness had been exposed after the Sino-Japanese defeat. The fact that Russia obtained their ice-free port and managed to connect it via railway to Europe convinced the other European powers they had to act quickly to maintain their own sphere of influence. France, Britain, and Germany started encroaching onto the Chinese periphery, and sometimes straight-up seized ports and trading posts. The practice was pretty much in line with modern imperialism common during that time. A more detailed overview of this scramble for concessions will be outlined in my video about the Boxer Rebellion next week. And as for domestic politics in China, the defeat was extremely humiliating and caused a rift between the conservatives and the progressives. There was no way around it. China, once center of the world, was on the back foot. In Beijing, China's brightest young scholars had gathered around, unanimously denouncing the Treaty of Shimonoseki and demanding a new modernized and stronger program of economic growth and governmental reform. During the closing decade of the 19th century, elements of old and new existed side by side in China. The years after the Sino-Japanese War saw a reform movement that emphasized the need to use Western learning for practical developments, while Chinese learning was to remain the essence. The Guangxu Emperor was eventually convinced to issue radical reforms, much to the dismay of the arch-conservatives. These arch-conservatives, among whom the Empress Dowager Cixi, immediately started planning ways to obstruct the emperor, even ways to get rid of him. The Western powers victorious in multiple wars had not just imposed their will on China, but encroached on Chinese territory as well. The impact of foreign imperialism was profound, and intensified the tense atmosphere already present in China due to the self-strengthening movement. Contained mainly to treaty ports with a Western presence, modern influences in China were barely noticeable in the mainland. Even European merchants attempting to move inland had to rely on Chinese middlemen. Foreigners were regarded as exotic the deeper into China one went. Marriages were arranged, girls' feet were still bound, and there was barely any access to formal education. For bright young men, their career path was set in stone, as had been for many centuries, memorizing Confucian classics, studying hard-to-pass local exams, provincial exams, and eventually the national exam in order to enter the Chinese bureaucratic order. Following the Sino-Japanese War, a new reformist movement sprung up, attempting to reassure the value of Chinese self-strengthening. Zhang Qitung popularized the slogan Chinese learning for the essential principles, Western learning for practical applications. Holding onto the belief that Chinese traditionalist moral and philosophical values gave meaning to civilization, this position did allow for the adoption of Western practices and the hiring of Western advisors. Earlier in the 19th century, a group of scholars, among whom Yuan, began to put their focus of their work on practical political and economic challenges and problems. This was the so-called statecraft school. During the same time, the new text school of Confucianism emerged. This new text school propagated the notion that the new text versions of the Han classics allowed for state reforms to be instigated. Now, this is extremely important. Generations upon generations of scholars had been indoctrinated by their studies in the all-embracing social theory of Confucianism, which emphasized strict hierarchy and traditional values. As such, it was crucial for a change to be sanctioned by these very same ideas. Adopting Western weaponry during the Opium Wars and Western ideas to reform the administration had to be justified by old texts. And as such, basing his works on Confucius, Qing started writing a far-reaching program of modernization for China. Its goal was to model China after a constitutional monarchy based on Japanese and European examples. After the Sino-Japanese War, the opportunity Qing had been waiting for presented itself, or so it seemed. The disastrous defeat of China against a smaller Japan and the encroachment of Western powers right after led to an extreme Chinese response. Already in 1895, there were protests in Beijing during the national exam. Over 1,300 exam candidates signed a petition led by no other than Kang Yue and another scholar, Li Qichao, that requested the Qing not accept the peace demands of the peace treaty. As for the rest of China, in many areas secret societies sprung up in which its members debated about how to reform China. In combination, for the first time, journals and newspapers were circulated outside treaty ports, introducing many Chinese to political commentary. While these developments were suppressed in some areas, in Hunan and Hubei provinces they were welcomed. Reforms and modernization were pushed by its governor-general, none other than Zhang Qitung. Zhang pressed for the development of a railway line from Hankou to Beijing and built up coal and iron mines. He modernized the capital, streets were paved, streetlights were built, telegraph lines constructed, and modern curricula in school was instated. Yet, Zhang was on good terms with the arch-conservatives, most notably the Empress Dowager Cixi, as he too was convinced of the need of the traditional Confucian ethical system. Cixi was on semi-retirement in her new-built summer palace, and the reform memorial by Kang finally reached the emperor. Kang and Liang were overjoyed when Kang was invited for an imperial audience. The first imperial audience lasted for 5 hours. It is the longest official audience in the history, at least of which the written record survives. During it, Kang was not only full of proposals, but also remarked that if the emperor were to rely on the conservatives for reform, it would be like climbing a tree to seek for fish. In 1898, Kang Yue, together with his younger accomplices Liang Qichao and Tan Situng, received the support of the 27-year-old Guangxu emperor. Between June and September that year, China was flooded with reform edicts, which would change China drastically in virtually every aspect. The government institutions, the traditional exam system, the army, everything would be modernized. The emperor wanted to reduce the importance of traditional poetry in exams, transform old academies to modern schools, and abolish the 8-legged essay altogether. To many, this was about time. He furthermore addressed the need to strengthen China's armed forces. Its navy was destroyed after the Sino-Japanese War, and the funds allocated to the rebuilding of the navy went into the construction of the summer palace of Tongzhi. Yeah, really. Qing proposed that the traditional internal administration with safeguards against enemies from within was useless against the current Western enemies from outside. In his opinion, a cabinet type of domestic administration had to replace the traditional 6 ministries and Grand Council. Observing the Japanese example, he noted a parliament was more efficient at raising taxes and checking corruption. Kang Yue was appointed as secretary in the Zhongli Yamen, the government body in charge of foreign policy. European diplomats eagerly welcomed these reforms, but it goes without saying that these modern reforms sparked much resistance from the conservatives and traditionalists, not to mention those that simply were bound to profit from the old Chinese order. No, conservative opposition was loud and strong, and one of the several reasons was the fact that all reformers were Chinese, except for the emperor, who was of course a Manchu. Now, that Chinese reformers were influencing imperial policy, incumbent Manchus feared for their position. Those that held a degree from the traditional examination system feared educational reform would threaten their qualifications. The war on organized corruption threatened, well, nearly everyone that held office. In short, the young emperor was waging a war on the entire Chinese establishment and quickly found himself cornered from all sides. Radical reformers had the most influence in court, but that would change very soon. Distressed and quietly observing the reforms at first, Empress Dowager Cixi saw her entire power base threatened by the attack on her 2 pillars of power, organized corruption and classical learning. She started to plot the course of action with several arch-conservatives. On the 21st of September 1898, palace guards and eunuchs entered Emperor Guangxu's palace in the Forbidden City and seized all documents pertaining to reforms. Cixi returned to the Forbidden City as well and issued an edict 2 days later, stating the emperor had fallen ill. It was only right for her to assume regency and, as such, rule over China once again. How convenient. The emperor would remain under house arrest, virtually powerless until he died under mysterious circumstances in 1908. Suspiciously, just 1 day before the Empress Dowager herself passed away. At any rate, Cixi was in power, and there was hell to pay for all those that were in favor of reforms. 6 intellectuals, the so-called 6 gentlemen of Wushu, were arrested and executed, including Kang's younger brother and the famous philosopher Tongzhi. Kang and Liang managed to escape to Japan. The length of the intensive reforms of the emperor would only just pass 100 days. A revolution from above had failed, in contrast to the Meiji Restoration in Japan decades earlier. It suggested that the revolutionary change had to come from below. For now, the dreams for a reform program ended in disaster. As a result of the radical 100 days of reform, a reactionary period of less than 3 years by the conservatives led by Cixi now followed. They even considered ejecting Westerners with brutal force. It just so happened to be that in northern China, anti-Christian and anti-Western sentiments led to a violent climax. A group that was distantly related to the secret White Lotus Society sparked a rebellion that would once again dramatically change the course of China's history. This group was called the Fists of Harmony and Justice, more commonly known as the Boxers. Next week, we'll look at the unlikely alliance between this group of rebels and Empress Dowager Cixi in a desperate attempt to regain control over China. The Boxer Rebellion was the 4th and largest war Imperial China fought against Western powers during the 19th century. Oddly enough, in its early stages, the Boxer movement was pitted against both Western influences in China and the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. The Qing Empress Dowager Cixi, however, saw the possibility to use these rebels for her own ends and managed to court its leaders in order to forge an anti-Western alliance. It turned out to be a bit of a misjudgment on her side, to put it mildly. The Boxer Rebellion served as a testament to the instability and chaos that pestered China, and it definitely was one of the most interesting and tense episodes of Chinese history. By the time the Boxer Rebellion set China ablaze, the reigning Qing dynasty and Chinese people had suffered major hardships and defeats for decades. Around the 18th century, it was one of the most prosperous empires of the entire world. According to Agnes Madison's statistical estimates, China had the biggest share in the world's GDP, making it the largest economy in the world during the 18th century. But then, two opium wars between China and the British Empire ended in severe, humiliating Chinese defeats. Combined with the deadliest civil war ever seen, the Taiping Rebellion, together with several other massive rebellions, China's GDP plummeted. Treaties were signed, sovereignty was conceded, and Western powers gained a foothold in the country. Following the Opium Wars, the Chinese tried to reform and embark on a self-strengthening policy. The Sino-Japanese War 3 decades later led to the near total annihilation of China's fleet, complete defeat of its army, and subsequent humiliating peace treaty. It was the dark conclusion of China's failed reforms. A domestic crisis followed. Protests swept over the country. Something had to be done. Disasters were not only accredited to the Qing, but to foreigners as well. 2 German Catholic missionaries were murdered in the Shandong province under Governor Li Bingheng in 1898. This was used as a pretext to occupy multiple port cities and mining and railway rights by the Germans at first, only for the British, French, and Russians to quickly seize what they could get. Never waste a good crisis, right? Some Chinese, rightly so, feared their country was about to be carved up like a melon. It was in 1898 the Chinese Guangxu Emperor embarked on a radical reform program known as the 100 Days of Reform. These radical institutional reforms were unprecedented and would change China for good, if successful. Arch-conservatives within the government noticed this as well, and weren't too happy. The Empress Dowager Cixi managed to sway several conservative Manchu princes to support her and get rid of the emperor. After barely 100 days of reform, palace guards and eunuchs entered the emperor's palace, seized the documents pertaining to reform, and Cixi announced the emperor had suspiciously fallen ill. It was only right for her to assume leadership, she reasoned. How convenient. And Cixi? She would be the central figure during the Boxer Rebellion. Now that we know the background of the Boxer Rebellion, I don't think it's too difficult to grasp exactly why this anti-Western rebellion occurred. In 1898, one spark was enough to ignite a full-scale rebellion in northern China. The Yuan, crudely translated to Fists of Harmony and Justice, more commonly known as Boxers, were that spark. They were a secret society loosely affiliated with the White Lotus Society and Big Sword Society, embodying anti-foreign and anti-Christian sentiments. Located in northwestern Shandong, without real clear leadership, Boxer militias were composed mainly of peasants. They took to the streets and their slogan, "Remove the Qing, destroy the foreigners," immediately caught the attention of many disgruntled Chinese peasants. Their anti-dynastic sentiment was due to their conviction that the Qing dynasty had lost their mandate of heaven. Their interesting name, the Boxers, was based on their special way of boxing that was akin to a rhythmic-like exercise in an attempt to harmonize both spirit and muscle in preparation for combat. What followed was a ritual-like formula, a chant, breathing through clenched teeth and frothing. The Boxers would claim they were possessed by spirits and were invulnerable to sabers and foreign bullets. Well, when demonstrations of this feat were held, it wouldn't always go according to plan. Nevertheless, during combat they relied on their fists and sticks rather than modern weaponry. There were female boxer groups as well, most famous, the Red Lantern Shining. They fought alongside the Boxers. As rebellion broke out, the initial targets were Chinese Christians and the occasional Western missionary. Over time, the Boxer Rebellion gained momentum and spread across Shandong, sweeping village after village, without Beijing undertaking any countermeasures. The rest of the world wasn't too invested in this obscure rebellion in China. It would not be until 1900 when this rebellion overtook the front page of Western newspapers, pushing the ongoing Boer War to the second page. The brutality of the Boxers would shock the world. Boxers slaughtered and plundered as they made their way from the countryside towards Chinese cities, among which Beijing. And over there in Beijing, the European diplomat legation was housed. These diplomats did not feel threatened, for now. When the Qing finally decided to take action against the Boxers in late 1899, it wasn't a surprise the Boxers suffered some massive defeats against Qing troops. The Boxers now probably realized they could not fight two enemies at once and took a more accommodating stance towards the Qing dynasty. Their anti-dynastic rhetoric became more moderate. Empress Dowager Cixi saw the success of the Boxer Rebellion as an instrument she could use to counter the encroachment of these European powers to whom the Boxers refer to as hairy ones. Cixi issued several edicts serving to protect Boxers in early 1900. She decided to join forces with the Boxers against these hairy ones. As such, the Boxers' new battle cry would be support the Qing government and exterminate the foreigners. As for the Western diplomats residing in the capital, Beijing, not too far away from Cixi, who was now plotting to wage war against their nations, the diplomats were confident of Western superiority and were slow to recognize that the Empress Dowager, after decades of unequal treaties, suppression, and encroachment, was finally prepared to let this popular movement challenge the West by force. Some Chinese governors were happy with this new alliance. The governor of Shandong, for example, a Manchu by the name of Yuan, publicly encouraged the Boxers to take action against Christians as they saw fit. He even helped them out, massacring all Christians he gathered in his capital under the pretense of protection. Cixi did not enjoy popular support from all civil servants. Those that served in the provinces that were suffering under the Boxers' violence considered the pro-Boxer stance of Cixi to be self-destructive, but that could do nothing against the Boxers without unleashing an all-out civil war, and as such, Boxers continued to pillage and murder. Cixi didn't mind the Christian purges and opposition to Western influence, although the cost for some provinces certainly was heavy. Alright, so during the spring of 1900, Cixi issued several more decrees that implicitly supported the Boxer movement. Foreign diplomats, slowly waking up to what was going on, protested against it and decided that they had to resort to violence if the Qing government didn't undertake any action against these thugs. Meanwhile, a squadron of 17 Western warships had anchored just outside Taku. As the Boxers were advancing towards Beijing, massacring and pillaging along the way, the diplomats requested military protection and the fleet let 455 Marines disembark. Once they reached Beijing, their number was described as dangerously low. Regardless of their number, this iconic photograph was the result of these 8 nations fighting together. Some diplomats were worried, but others, among which Sir Cloud MacDonald, the British ambassador, weren't necessarily worried about the Boxers, more so about the possibility of an international scramble for concessions if the Qing were to collapse. They had to get their fair share after all. All the while, the Boxers kept advancing onto Beijing, destroying railway lines on the way, isolating the capital. As Boxers encircled the city days later, the worries about the scramble for concessions faded to the background, even for Claude MacDonald. That same afternoon, MacDonald had requested, with urgency, reinforcements from the British Admiral, Sir Edward Seymour. Seymour, stationed several days of travel away, left with 2,000 soldiers composed of 8 different nationalities. The next morning, he planned to travel the entire distance by train, repairing the railroads on the way. On the planned date of arrival, several trucks were waiting at the Beijing station to transport the reinforcements that would arrive, but none arrived. Seymour was referred to as Seymour from then on. Wasn't really his fault though. As soon as Seymour left, his force was attacked by a mixture of Boxers and Qing troops. Later that day, in Beijing, Sugiyama Akira, the chancellor of the Japanese legation, went to the railway station, unaccompanied, wearing a bowler hat and a Western suit. He seemed like the perfect target for Boxers and loyalist Qing troops. He was apprehended by Kansu braves, Muslims loyal to the Qing, hacked into pieces, and beheaded. His mutilated corpse left on the street. Meanwhile, Seymour abandoned the expedition. There were several skirmishes between Boxers and Westerners throughout the province, and Dagu forts were seized by Western troops to provide cover for a troop landing. Within Beijing, tensions rose. The reactionary and pro-Boxer Prince Yuan was appointed as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He issued an order which allowed the Boxers to enter the capital, roaming the streets dressed in motley uniforms of red, black or yellow turbans and red leggings, killing Chinese Christians. Several days later, Cixi was informed, albeit falsely, that the European powers wished her to abdicate in favor of the emperor. In a rage, she ordered all diplomats to leave Beijing the next day. The next morning, German imperial envoy Baron Clemens von Kettler left the legation in order to discuss the situation with Qing representatives. He was shot and killed in the middle of the street. None of the diplomats even considered leaving the legation after this. Not leaving the city meant defying Cixi's will, however. The legations were fortified as the Boxers started surrounding the area, waiting for the ultimatum to expire. This was one of the most tense moments for the Europeans, locked in their legation quarter. The foreign legations would number around 60 men, given normal circumstances. During the siege, there were 475 foreign civilians, 450 Marines, and 3,000 Chinese Christians that were granted asylum at the last minute. The legation under siege was divided in various ethnic squadrons under the command of MacDonald. The presence of 150 ponies ensured fresh meat. The real problem was the lack of ammunition, though. The Japanese didn't have more than 100 bullets per man, and the best equipped defenders didn't have more than 300. As Tsuchi's ultimatum expired, the Boxers opened fire. The siege of the legation had begun. The next day, on the 21st of June, the Qing imperial government officially declared war on the European powers after receiving news about the Dagu fortresses. Boxers, now a loyal militia, took the opportunity to launch a series of attacks on mission compounds around Tongzhi, Hebei, and Henan. A little bit further down the road, the Roman Catholic cathedral was in even more trouble. Bishop Favier and his 3,000 followers, among which 800 converted Chinese schoolgirls, were protected merely by 43 French and Italian Marines. Boxers started setting fire to the surrounding buildings. The famous National Academy, with her irreplaceable library, was torched. A while back, the Chinese government had bought new Krupp guns, ideal for situations such as this one. Though General Ronglu refused to use them. Instead, he ordered his troops to fire empty shells. Ronglu wasn't the only Qing official refusing official orders from court, however. Cixi didn't have much support from other Chinese governors, and many provinces refused to send troops towards Beijing, declaring themselves neutral. China's political system of a relatively decentralized government had proven of some practical use. Fairbank and Reisha are right. I'll give you an example. Liu Zhang, together with the Canton Governor General and Imperial Commissioner Liu Kuni, ignored Cixi's declaration of war, and as such, China, except for the northern provinces, remained neutral. The convenient fiction was accepted, and the Boxer outbreak was a rebellion instead of a war supported by the Qing dynasty. After a month of siege, the casualties in the legation were heavy, and the amount of Boxers and Qing forces were even heavier. It was a dire situation, but on the 17th of July, much to the surprise of the legation, the Chinese declared an armistice. Thing is, communication was obviously rather slow. As a wink to contemporary times, what happened in the newspapers all over the world can be considered a historic example of fake news. The Daily Mail published an article stating the legation had fallen and all those inside had been slaughtered. The Times published the obituary of MacDonald. Around the 23rd of July, a memorial was organized in the United Kingdom in order to commemorate the fallen legation. The memorial was promptly cancelled, however, once news reached Europe that the legation hadn't fallen at all. The article in the Daily Mail did have its consequences, however. The German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II told his fleet that was preparing to sail towards China, "No mercy, no prisoners. Kill all those you can capture, and make them remember the German name." Eventually, the German soldiers made sure. Many would remember their name indeed. Nearby Tianjin, a new international military force was congregating under Lieutenant General Alfred Gasly. The fact a foreign force numbering in the thousands was gathering probably played a role in the Qing's decision to proclaim an armistice. Tianjin was swiftly captured, but instead of immediately advancing towards Beijing, the commanders decided to wait until they gathered over 20,000 troops. The military force wouldn't leave Tianjin for 3 more weeks. Meanwhile, the situation around the legation turned sour again. Li Bingheng, the anti-foreign governor, arrived in Beijing at the end of July. The armistice was broken and the legation was once again under siege. 2 weeks later, the relief force finally arrived at the gates of Beijing. Gathering around the city walls, it was agreed the European divisions would assault the city at dawn. Now, international rivalry probably inspired the decision by the Russians to attack that night on their own, suffering heavy casualties. Not the most tactical decision, but they did breach the walls nevertheless. That morning, others followed, and it was the Brits that managed to reach the legation first. Shortly thereafter, the Japanese rescued the cathedral. Boxer resistance crumbled, and key Qing commanders took their own life. The Europeans immediately started looting the city. The Germans, arriving late, were exceptionally zealous and torched the villages surrounding the city. They certainly followed Kaiser Wilhelm's orders. Mass executions took place, with hundreds of Boxers beheaded on the streets. As the European troops entered Beijing, Cixi and the Qing imperial court fled the city, traveling on farmers' carts. The Guangxu Emperor too was evacuated, but in a last act of spite, Cixi refused to allow his favorite concubine to travel with him. The concubine's life would end at the bottom of a well in the Forbidden City. Now, the Boxers were defeated, and over 45,000 soldiers of foreign powers were standing in northern China. Cixi and the Qing imperial court had fled towards the remote Xi'an. Peace negotiations from the Chinese side were conducted by Liu, and international rivalry between the European powers meant they couldn't gain too much and punish China too harshly. Installing a regime such as in British India would have caused more chaos, and as such, the European powers demanded that pro-Boxer civil servants were punished and large indemnities had to be paid. The Qing dynasty, however, the Chinese Empire, and their own privileged positions were maintained. Empress Dowager Cixi could stay on as the regent. On the 17th of September, the Boxer Protocol was signed. In it, the death penalty was demanded for high-ranking civil servants such as Yuan and many more Boxers. In 45 cities, exams were cancelled for 5 years, which meant the high posts in the civil servant apparatus could not be attained anymore. All import of arms into China was prohibited for 2 years, and Western troops should be allowed to permanently reside within China. $333 million had to be paid as indemnity, spread over a period of 39 years with interest, which meant the total amount paid would be more than double. The amount was staggering, for it was nearly 4 times the total annual Qing income. The UK and US thought it so severe they offered to return some of the money as educational funds for Chinese students studying abroad. The siege of Beijing lasted for 55 days. 55 foreigners were murdered, whereas during the entire rebellion, over 200 missionaries, 2,000 foreign soldiers, and over 30,000 Chinese Christians were murdered. The official death toll among the Qing troops and Boxers has never been released, though it must have numbered in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. And that's how China entered the 20th century. A defeated nation that once again had to give up land, wealth and lives for the sake of European powers. As Cixi could stay on as regent, the next decade would be marked by an ambitious reform program by the Qing. It was too little, too late, however. The last decades of the Qing Empire saw the concurrent rise of a strong reform movement and the first truly modern Chinese Revolutionary Party, the Kuomintang of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. This week we'll look into the background of the important reformers and revolutionary movements within China that eventually toppled the Qing dynasty. To be fair, this video is centered more around Sun Yat-sen, as the most important reform movements have already been covered in 2 previous videos. Sun Yat-sen's story, however, well, the man certainly lived an adventurous life, to say the least. After the 100 days of radical reform under the Guangxu Emperor, in 1898, Empress Dowager Cixi launched her conservative coup d'état. Those reformers that managed to flee established the Society of Protecting the Emperor. Their goal was to realize a constitutional monarchy under Emperor Guangxu and the incremental creation of a parliament. China ought to modernize, and it needed the full support of its nation. A constitutional monarchy was China's best bet to successfully modernize. Kang Youwei, together with Liang Qichao, the principal architects of the 100 Days Reform, managed to flee to Japan. They received much support from young Chinese, many of whom studied in Tokyo and Kyoto. Due to educational reforms on the Chinese mainland, Kang's idea found support from the new Chinese intelligentsia, schooled under the new system. What exactly were the ideas by Kang that met so much resistance by the Qing and support among the young intelligentsia? Well, Kang reinterpreted many Confucian classics. He interpreted a passage in the Book of Rites as prescribing linear growth and evolution. 3 stages he defined were disorder, approaching peace and small tranquility, and great peace and great unity. Based on this analysis, China was currently moving from a period of disorder towards approaching peace and small tranquility. Kang, in essence, managed to align all Chinese texts with Western theories of evolution and progress. This is very important, as reform in China ought to be based on the classic texts and Confucian thought that so many civil servants and gentry were schooled upon. Part of the gentry, especially merchants and middle-class citizens living in urban areas, longed for modernization. Chinese immigrant communities and capitalists longed for a stronger state that was able to protect their interests. At any rate, Kang stayed for a time at Prince Okuma's, the founder of the Japanese Progressive Party. He had been Japan's prime minister, albeit briefly, in 1898, and was the author of the Okuma Doctrine, In essence, this doctrine propagated the notion that due to Japan modernizing before China, it owed the country a debt of aiding it with its process of modernization and guaranteeing its freedom. Inukai, a follower of Okuma, went to great lengths to have Chinese political exiles and revolutionaries meet each other. Inukai even managed to issue a meeting between Kang Yue and the founder of the revived China Society, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Kang refused to meet Sun unless he'd pledge his allegiance, and the two men had fundamentally different notions of reformist thought. Sun considered a revolution necessary in order to establish a republic, while Kang vowed his loyalty to the Guangxu emperor. Collaboration wasn't likely, but Sun Yat-sen, he would become very important in China's history for the decades to come. After 1905, the considerable moderate group of reformers would be surpassed in popularity by a much more radical organization led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. So, what exactly were their objectives, and who was Sun Yat-sen himself? Well, like Kang Yue, Sun Yat-sen too was originally from Canton, although from early on he had traveled all over the world. Canton, traditionally at the center of Western imperialism in China, harbored groups of Chinese with strong anti-Western and anti-Qing feelings, as the Qing had been unable to protect the Chinese against the Westerners. Whereas Kang was educated based on Confucian classics, Sun Yat-sen received an entirely westernized education. The Sino-French War, also known as the Tonkin War, and China's defeat of 1885 sparked his patriotism after experiencing the war up close. Sun Yat-sen was ambivalent during his early life, however, asking himself whether he wanted to reform China or lead a revolution. It boiled down to one question: did China have to be destroyed for it to be built up? Though not fruitful, Sun Yat-sen attempted to receive Liu Yongzhang's advice about and support for his reform ideas. Liu Yongzhang was the military leader of the anti-Taiping forces during the rebellion and notable proponent of the self-strengthening movement during the 1860s and 70s. He was convinced the usage of Western weaponry and military tactics would be necessary to safeguard the traditional Chinese values and rebuild Chinese strength and power in order to prevent further Western influence. Use the barbarians to control the barbarians, as I said. Interestingly enough, this stood in stark contrast with Sun Yat-sen's conviction, who attempted to convince Li that the wealth, strength, and power of Western powers was not due to their gunboats and weaponry, but thanks to their education and the belief that people ought to develop fully to their capability. Free markets and usage of land, the developed codes of law, were among other things. Li did not even bother to grant Sun an audience, as Sun persistently argued in favor of these reasons. Bitter and disappointed, in 1894 in Honolulu, Hawaii, he founded the Revived China Society, a radical anti-Manchu secret organization. Its 112 members swore to expel the Manchu and install a federal republic. In 1895, together with 3,000 sympathizers, Sun attempted to seize control of Canton. The whole rebellion was badly organized and had inadequate weaponry and funding. Qing authorities got wind of it, rounded as many revolutionaries up as they could, and 48 were to be executed. Sun fled the country, now officially living in exile as a revolutionary. From Hong Kong, Sun went to Japan and the United States, eventually traveling to Europe. Imperial agents attempted to kidnap Sun multiple times throughout these years. One of the more famous and admittedly clumsy attempts was a kidnap attempt in London, where Sun was locked up by Qing agents in the Chinese legation in London. The goal was to ship him back to China, have him stand trial, and have him executed. He was freed, however, and the botched abduction turned him into somewhat of a celebrity around Europe. Sun traveled all over Europe and the United States, refining his political thoughts and views. While in exile, the conservative coup against the emperor by Empress Dowager Cixi and the humiliating Boxer Protocol of 1901 only grew Sun's prestige, while that of the dynasty dwindled. Sun now seeking support from the same groups that Kang Yue was seeking support from. This shaped a bitter rivalry between the two men, whose political views, as we touched upon before, were far apart, though both condemned by Beijing. One such supporter was Charlie Soong. His 3 daughters would play a major role in Chinese politics during the next century. Qing Ling married Sun Yat-sen, only to join the communists under Mao Zedong after Sun's death, and Mei Ling married Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang and the staunch opponent of Mao's communists. I promise you will hear more about them in a separate video. Sun Yat-sen's political program encompassed 3 main points, which I will elaborate a bit upon. The first was the principle of nationalism. Sun Yat-sen wanted to liberate the Chinese from the foreign Manchu domination. Due to political and strategic reasons, Sun did not resist the foreigners and, on multiple occasions, explicitly confirmed he would comply with treaty agreements that Qing had signed. After all, Sun's revolution would have no chance of succeeding if he turned on the Western powers. The second principle was a people's power, and it encompassed the gradual implementation of Western-style democracy. The first stage after the revolution would be a military-style dictatorship. The second phase, an incremental democracy, and the last phase would be the implementation of a proper democracy. The institutions within the state would consist of 5 powers: the Montesquieu's trias politica, legislative, judiciary, and executive powers, supplemented with 2 traditionally Chinese institutions, a control, audit branch, and an examination branch, in order to select civil servants. Lastly, the third principle is as translated as people's welfare and livelihood. A government for the people, if you will. It was the socio-economic part of Sun's program. Emphasis was put on, among others, John Stuart Mill's theory that the value of land would increase due to industrialization. The increase in value should, via taxing the land, be distributed among the Chinese population. It would be the solution to social inequality. Interestingly enough, these 3 principles remain as of today the credo of China's Nationalist Party in Taiwan. In 1905, under Japanese encouragement, Sun Yat-sen was brought into contact with Wang Xing and others of the Yunnan group. They would go on to establish the Kuomintang in 1911, but for now, in Tokyo in 1905, the Tongzhi, the Revolutionary Alliance, was established. Sun was its chief executive, Wang Xing was the second in command, and other prominent revolutionaries were assigned to key posts. The Tongzhi had offices all over the world, from Brussels to Singapore. It had branches in 17 Chinese provinces. The Tongzhi was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Republican and socialist ideas in line with Sun's ideology were distributed via the official Tongzhi journal, The People, Min Pao. So Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei's ideas for reform and a constitutional monarchy, following Japan's example, were vigorously attacked. It was argued that China would be able to surpass the West if only a few strong men took control of the country. Interestingly enough, Japan was used as an example for this point of view as well. Sun's 3-stage program for democracy was backed by the magazine, though it seemed a bit simplistic. It was more appealing than the moderate views of a benevolent monarch. At any rate, after the Guangxu Emperor suspiciously passed away in 1908, one day before Empress Dowager Cixi died, and the 3-year-old Pu Yi ascended to the throne, well, there was barely a case to be made in favor of that theory anyway. Throughout the years, there were several setbacks the revolutionaries suffered. Sun instigated 10 rebellions between 1906 and 11, all of them failed. In 1907, Sun Yat-sen was expelled from Japan after repeated requests by the Qing to the Japanese government. Both Sun and Wang Xing settled in Hanoi, French Indochina, and orchestrated 6 rebellions in China while residing there. The French realized these revolutionaries were inspiring the Vietnamese to stage their own uprisings and expelled them as well. In 1909, after 4 years of barely any results but many casualties, be it due to failed rebellions or government crackdowns, foreign financial aid in support of the revolution dwindled. Once again, Sun embarked on a fundraising campaign to Eastern Europe and the United States. Some other members dissenting from the Tongzhi resorted to anarchism. It was Wang Qinwei who tried to bomb the Prince Regent Chun. His assassination attempt failed and he was arrested and imprisoned. Nevertheless, anti-Qing sentiment among the Chinese population kept increasing. Wang Xing figured subverting troops of the imperial army had the best chance of succeeding. An army revolt in Canton in 1910, however, was suppressed. Another Canton rebellion a year later was doomed. When Wang's troops tried to seize government buildings, one of the battalions mistook another group of their soldiers for imperial soldiers, and a firefight between the 2 groups of revolutionaries ensued. It did garner widespread sympathy and is memorialized with a large concrete obelisk that honored the 72 revolutionaries that lost their lives. Now, Sun instigated 10 rebellions, right? Well, across China in 1909 there were 113 documented rebellions, most instigated by hungry peasants. The next year there were 285. I think these numbers clearly portray the instability of the country. Most rebellions occurred around the region where the Taiping Rebellion waged 50 years before. Still, riots elsewhere broke out without a revolutionary ideology at the basis. The peasant peace riots in Hunan in 1910 and eventually the provincial railway protection movement that swept Szechuan in 1911 contributed to the erosion of Qing stability and control. It was a railway controversy that would directly contribute to the sequence of events that would lead to the demise of the Qing dynasty. I felt it was only right to provide a bit of background to the revolutionary movement that played a crucial part in this Xinhai revolution. Next week, I'll cover that revolution, oddly enough sparked by accident, and the abdication of Puyi, the last emperor, marking the demise of the Qing dynasty, which had now truly lost its mandate of heaven. We have seen China suffer devastating rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion. The country suffered a humiliating defeat after the Sino-Japanese War, and the Boxer Rebellion saw China suffer massive losses at the hand of 8 different nations. And yet, the Qing dynasty was still standing after all that had happened. The Qing embarked on a period of institutional and social reforms. These reforms, however, were an exemplary case of too little, too late, and the once mighty Qing dynasty would survive for just little under a decade. Following the Chinese defeat after the Boxer Rebellion, the imperial Qing court was convinced a new approach was required for its reign to continue. This conviction bore a bit of resemblance with the attitude after China got defeated during the Second Opium War in 1860. As a result, during this period until 1911, many reforms proposed in 1898 were now realized. Ironically, Empress Dowager Cixi and her conservative allies launched a coup against these reformers under the Guangxu Emperor in 1898 and deposed of them. The irony is hopefully not lost on many. These reforms would be implemented, though it would not be enough to save the Qing dynasty. Consider it political quicksand. The more the dynasty attempted to save itself, the deeper it sank. During the Boxer Rebellion, several governor-generals of provinces remained neutral towards both foreign powers, Boxers, and the Qing dynasty. Among these were Chiang Chi-tung and Liu Kuni, 2 of the most famous officials during that time. These men now presented 3 joint memorials to Empress Dowager Cixi in which they outlined a program that was reminiscent of the 100 Days Reform. With several understatements apparent in the text, they still managed to point out the dire situation the Qing dynasty found itself in and convinced Cixi of the necessity of reform. Now, China's example when it came to modernization was its island neighbor, Japan. Reason for this was that the island seemed to have discovered the answer to Western aggression and encroachment. During the Sino-Japanese War, it already showcased its superiority in military tactics and equipment. The years after, Japan agreed to treaties with Western powers that weren't on unequal footing, like the other Asian powers had been forced to sign. One of the most telling was the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance. Japan could take a tougher stance against Russia, with whom it had tense relations due to the Russians not only withholding Port Arthur from the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War, but occupying the Liaodong Peninsula themselves several years later. And if you remember the video about the geopolitics preceding the Sino-Japanese War, both countries were still dead set on gaining influence in Korea and Manchuria. Russian troops in Manchuria eventually led to the Russo-Japanese War. If you're interested in a more detailed background, I've made 2 videos about that. Japan defeated Russia, and the war saw the largest battle in the world to date. Japan's victory impressed all Asian nations, as it was the first time in modern times a Western power was defeated by an Asian one. In China especially, Japan became even more of an example for reforms. At the top of the long list of reforms proposed to Empress Dowager Cixi was the reform of education in order to create a new, competent elite. Immediately after 1900, the government embarked on a thorough reform of education. It adhered to the traditional Chinese notion that recruiting talent is the most important element to realize good governance. What's interesting is that the Japanese educational system became the blueprint, and China attempted to attract Japanese teachers. Back in 1898, a modern imperial university was established in Beijing, the Beida. The Qing government invested heavily in erecting modern schools, although at its core, the system remained weak. These modern schools, it was thought, would supplant the traditional examination system in a decade. The traditional system could not be abolished immediately due to the scholar officials with vested interest in it. After all, they enjoyed a natural dominance in both urban and rural areas due to exactly that system. The goal of the modern schools was not to educate the Chinese masses, nor a liberal education of the individual. It was to train and select officials more effectively. One of the first steps of modernity was the abolition of the traditional 8-legged essay. It had existed for nearly 5 centuries by that point. Unfortunately, the traditional route of education remained cheaper than the costly new modern schooling. Officials shunned the new government schools, and to top it all off, the new schools faced tough competition from Western missionary schools, established in strategic treaty ports and cities. Private enterprises also spurred up. A perfect example are the Changpo Ling and Yan Xiu, who opened a middle school in Tianjin, acquiring a campus over the years, eventually growing into the Nankai University. Right. So I mentioned that Japan was an example to China when it came to modernization. Well, Chiang Chi-tung sent 2 missions to Japan in order to study its educational system and import its textbooks. Japanese professors were imported to China as well, and Chiang started to see Japan as a more favored training ground for teachers as opposed to Europe. It was cheaper. There obviously was a similar cultural element, and many Western books had already been translated to Japanese. After Japan won the Russo-Japanese War, the Chinese program for educational modernization accelerated, and the state exam system was formally abolished that same year. This event cannot be emphasized enough. It basically tore away the fundamental Confucianist basis China was built on. Traditional education made way for a mixed Sino-Western curriculum. Western works were translated to Chinese by, among others, Lin Shu and Yan Fu. The latter concluded that the secret to Western power was in Western thought. He translated Huxley, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Montesquieu, and many others. It truly was a massive shift in Chinese thought and education. Before 1905, several important reforms had already been issued. First of all, the central governmental apparatus was modernized. The ancient 6-ministry organ was supplemented with several other ministries, such as education, foreign affairs, trade, police, and industry. Attempts to adequately manage government funds met with much resistance from those that were personally benefited from the traditional tax law. The Qing government faced much resistance from the provincial authorities as well, as these felt their autonomy was directly threatened by the centralization of power. A more modest attempt was made to reform Chinese law. This reform was absolutely necessary if the Western powers would ever want to cede their extraterritorial rights. The modernization of the army was rather successful. Many civil servants tasked with raising troops used Japanese knowledge, experience, and officers, while Chinese officers such as no other than Chiang Kai-shek traveled to Japan in 1907 to receive advanced military education. Now, the following is an interesting story about Chinese military. By 1901, there were 3 main types of military organizations. The traditional Manchu banner forces, together with the decentralized Chinese constabulary, the Army of the Green Standard. These were pretty much useless and backward compared to modern military forces. Archery, sword brandishing, and lifting a heavy stone were criteria to be selected as a soldier. You can imagine that these ancient rituals were of no use against a modern force. The second military force in China were regional armies under control by Chinese civil officials. Examples are the Yunnan army built by Zhang Guofan during the Taiping Rebellion. While it had been formally disbanded, together with Li Hongzhang's Anhui army, these forces continued to exist. These soldiers were regionally recruited and weren't part-time farmer soldiers, but professional fighters, also referred to as braves. The umbrella term for these forces, and I've named 2, but there were several more, was the defense army. There was rivalry among these forces and they lacked standardized armament, though they had more modern Western weaponry as compared to the Manchu banners. The last one was a military organization created in response to Japanese aggression. In the 1880s, Li Hongzhang and Chiang Chi-tung set up military academies and hired German officers to train their new Chinese forces. While Chiang created an army based on the German model in Nanking, the unit developed under Yuan Shikai was more significant. We met him in Korea around 20 years ago as Li's pro-consul, but he now laid the basis of the so-called Peiyang clique and became the father of the warlords. And that's no understatement. Among his early officers, at least 10 of them would become military governors after the Xinhai Revolution, and 5 became presidents or premiers of the Beijing government under the Republic. His army was the most disciplined, modernized, and best paid. After Li Hongzhang and Liu Kuni died in 1901 and 1902 respectively, Yuan Shikai was the chief army builder. As you can imagine, we will hear much more from Yuan at later stages. After the Boxer Rebellion, the early stages of a modern economy became visible. During the Peace of Shimonoseki in 1895, Japan enforced their right to establish factories at treaty ports. Thanks to the most favored nations clause, other countries could now establish their own factories in these areas as well. Foreign industrial activities using cheap Chinese labor stimulated Chinese competition. After 1900, this growth expanded, though still modest, from the treaty ports to Chinese companies more inland. Everywhere in China, chambers of commerce were established, and once the Ministry of Trade and Industry was created, this economical development was stimulated even more. During the last decade, the Qing dynasty was in power. The cleavage between the gentry and merchants and industrialists started to fade. The gentry started to focus on trading and industrial endeavors, which was indirectly stimulated by the abolishing of the state exam system. Meanwhile, the loyalty towards the Qing dynasty started to weaken even more, as more Chinese gentry, but other classes as well, started to prioritize their own regional economic fortunes over dynastic stability. The Qing government attempted to solidify the support they enjoyed, and during this process, it became very clear the loyalty of its citizens had been worn down. After Japan defeated Russia in 1905, constitutionalism seemed to be the type of government that provided the basis for unity between rulers and ruled. This notion was underpinned not just due to Japan's constitutionalism. Now, Russia, as a result of losing the war, made plans to move towards a parliamentary government via the Duma themselves. I have detailed Russia's first parliament and constitution in a separate video if that interests you. The Qing issued representative bodies for which Japan once again served as the blueprint. Empress Dowager Cixi announced in 1908 the incremental introduction of a constitution and parliament. The transition period would be 9 years, just like in Japan, where a parliament was promised in 1880 and it finally met in 1889. The first step would be the implementation of a provincial assembly in 1909, whereas Chiang Kai-shek sent 2 delegations to Japan to study the educational system. The Qing court sent 2 delegations to Europe and the United States, and 1 to Japan. The delegates met with Prince Ito, the president of the advisory council to the emperor. Ito emphasized the importance of an emperor maintaining supreme power, standing above the population, if you will, while promoting crucial elements such as public debate. But rather important and game-changing, that same year, in 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi passed away. But there was an emperor dethroned during the conservative coup 10 years earlier, right? Emperor Guangxi, who was only 37 and didn't suffer from health problems. Well, he died under mysterious circumstances, exactly 1 day before Cixi passed away. Cixi had, in fact, appointed a 3-year-old Pu Yi as her successor. Prince Chun, Pu Yi's father, became the prince regent. Prince Chun barely managed to influence Chinese policy, and the de facto strongest man of the country was General Yuan Shikai. While Yuan offered his services to the emperor, Prince Chun feared Yuan's influence, dismissing him. Yuan complied, though bitterly offended. Dismissing Yuan would have far-reaching consequences for the Qing dynasty. Chiang Kai-shek died in October that same year. Alright, so the Qing dynasty faced another problem when it came to administrative function. The central administration was reorganized under the aforementioned 11 ministries, but the Qing did not want to create an agency to control and coordinate these ministries. Simply put, the person at its head would assume too much power. The representative of all 16 new provincial assemblies, however, did meet, and its delegates turned out to be rather unruly and difficult to control. Regional interests trumped national interests, and the delegates demanded to speed up the establishment of the constitution and parliament. In turn, parliamentary representation was promised by the regent, Prince Chun, to be realized by 1913 instead of 17. In 1911, the first minister cabinet was established by Prince Chun, though it didn't really work in favor for the dynasty. Fairbank and Reischauer write that, with incredible ineptitude, he appointed 8 Manchus, 1 Mongol bannerman, and only 4 Chinese. It was one of the last twitches of the dying dynasty. Provincial versus central interests came to a climax over railway building. Western powers had managed to acquire rights to establish and control their own railways. As these railways were considered the tools of economic imperialism, the local Chinese gentry and merchants started to gather their own funds to establish their railways. This patriotic rights recovery movement did so in 2 ways. They either bought foreign railway companies, if possible, and secondly, they funded the actual building of Chinese railroads. The Qing government feared that these local initiatives to establish railways would further weaken the dynasty. And just as important, the dynasty itself did not have enough funds to start working on a national railroad. The funds that it did have were managed by corrupt officials, All these reasons led to the decision to nationalize the railroads in 1910. Funds once again proved the biggest obstacle though. Under Xinhai, centralization of railways had, in part, already taken place, and he now agreed to a loan from a group of foreign bankers, the so-called consortium. The final contract by the consortium coincided with an imperial decree advocated by Qing, which nationalized and bought out all local railroads, bringing them under Beijing supervision. A wave of protests erupted, and if you ponder on this act for a little, I'd imagine you too come to the conclusion that in essence it seemed that Shang, and by extension the Qing, were selling China to foreign bankers. In order to prevent this nationalization of railways, riots erupted in Sichuan in 1911, which quickly spiraled out of control. This time the gentry took a leading role in the rebellion. The fatal blow the Qing government received was an unexpected and unplanned military riot in Wuchang on the 11th of October 1911. This riot spread at such a fast pace that all the Qing court could do was call upon Yuan Shikai. Today has been all about the failed reforms the Qing issued the decade after the Boxer Rebellion. These reforms were too little, too late. Next week we'll look at the Wuchang Rebellion, which was the catalyst of the Xinhai Rebellion, the end of empire and abdication of Puyi, the last emperor, which would follow shortly. As we have seen the past couple of weeks, China's Qing dynasty suffered massive defeats and hardships throughout the 19th century. Surely this couldn't go on for much longer. And indeed, it wouldn't. In 1911, the sequence of events was triggered that would result in the abdication of China's last emperor and collapse of the Qing dynasty. Many plots had been devised for this to happen. Twisted irony had it that it started with an accidental bomb explosion with no master plan at all, and Sun Yat-sen, principal architect of the revolution, was thousands of miles away. Over the years, Qing power and their mandate of heaven had eroded. Movements such as the rights recovery movement, the Yunnan peasant riots, and natural disasters were all signs of a dynasty in severe decline. To give you an idea of China's state, there had been 285 uprisings and rebellions during 1910, the majority of which were sparked by peasants. Barely anywhere modern in the sense that they did not have a clear vision or ideological basis, but there was one modern revolutionary movement attempting to overthrow the Qing, the Revolutionary Alliance, or Tongmenghui. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was the founder of the Tongmenghui, China's first modern revolutionary secret society. I provided a bit of background about Sun and his organization in the video about China's reformers and revolutionaries. Although he instigated 10 rebellions between 1906 and 11, all of these were vaguely planned and none succeeded. Nevertheless, the amount of members of the Tongmenghui rose to 10,000 by 1911. Its members were from all walks of life, but generally well-educated Chinese that had studied abroad, most in Japan. Some revolutionaries were students, others were civil servants, members of the new provincial assemblies even, and several were soldiers or officers in the new army units. Thing is, many revolutionaries figured the best way to eventually spark revolution was to subvert Qing troops. They wanted to get the soldiers that weren't yet revolutionaries on their side, so to say. Revolutionaries joined the army, maintaining a low profile and recruiting other soldiers for their revolutionary cells. Throughout China, especially around the Wuchang, Hanyang, and Hankou districts in Wuhan, Hubei's capital, Qing opposition blossomed. Radical young Chinese formed revolutionary cells in these big cities. In 1911, big cities generally had multiple revolutionary cells. It was during this year Sun Yat-sen embarked on a fundraising campaign to the United States. After all, the revolution desperately needed funds if it was to succeed. In southern China, the strategy of infiltrating the new army units was adopted. Working with revolutionary branches active in the region, most cities had a sizable portion of their army secretly engaged in revolutionary activity. Not really a stable combination, to put it mildly. In order to recruit new members for their movement, these revolutionaries often created an elaborate guise of book clubs and fraternities. If authorities grew suspicious of these clubs and decided to investigate, they would simply disband their fake clubs only to regroup under a different name after some time at a different location. To give you an idea of how widespread this was, in 1911 around 5,000 to 6,000 of the Hubei new army troops turned out to be members of various secret revolutionary societies. This was about 1/3 of the total military force. Can you imagine? The fact that such a sizable amount of the military was part of secret resistance? Well, it was only a matter of time for things to turn sour. On the 9th of October 1911, a group of revolutionaries were fiddling with their bombs in their safe house, located in the Russian concession area of Hankou. They were planning a terrorist attack. Unfortunately for them, something went wrong and the bomb exploded prematurely. While oftentimes Western powers would bribe Qing authorities if something happened on their territory, the blast of this bomb was too heavy not to let the authorities investigate. The safe house was raided by Qing police and military. It quickly became clear what transpired, and the 3 men that had survived the blast were identified as revolutionaries. No time was wasted and they were executed immediately. Fate had it that the membership registers, in which all names of revolutionaries were written, thousands of them, survived the blast. The Qing authorities seized these and now possessed the names of most, if not all, revolutionaries in the city. Thing is, on this list were the names of their colleagues, at least 5,000 of them. Obviously alarmed at the amount of soldiers on the list, soldiers began rounding up all revolutionary soldiers they could find. Soldiers that were members of secret societies understood that if they did not act fast, they too would be put against the wall. The first force that mutinied was a small force, the Wucheng 8 Engineer Battalion. On the morning of October 10th, ever since celebrated as Double 10 Day, they seized the ammunition depot of the city and were subsequently joined by transport and artillery units. Wucheng's forts were captured, and by the end of the day 3 other regiments joined the resistance. After failed attempts to raise a sizable amount of loyal troops to protect his office, the Governor-General, Rucheng Manchu, fled the city together with the army commander. Forces that were still loyal to the Qing were routed and over 500 were killed. The next day, October 11th, Hanyang was captured by the revolutionaries. Its military arsenal and ironworks were seized. It was after the capture of Hanyang the mutineers established the military government of Hubei. But they didn't have a prestigious public figure to take control and lead the revolution. The principal architect of the revolution in China, Sun Yat-sen, was in the United States. He would not learn about the revolution until 1 month later, reading about it in a Denver newspaper. Instead of quickly returning to China and assume leadership of the revolution, he first went to the United Kingdom and France in order to secure European neutrality. He managed to sway the British government that they would not loan any capital to the Qing anymore. Sun eventually returned to China, but only over 2 months after the revolution had started. In October, the revolution, confined to Wuhan for now, was still looking for its leader. The first person the revolutionaries approached was the president of the Provincial Assembly, who was quick to decline the offer. One of the Hubei new army commanders, popular among his troops, Li Yuanhong, was the second one to receive the request. He wasn't a revolutionary, but had played a prominent role during the railway controversy against the Qing and was liked by those in the Provincial Assembly. It is said he was forced at gunpoint to take the assignment of leading these rebels. Now, I'm not sure how true that is, but he certainly was hesitant, but eventually accepted. The next day, Hankou troops mutinied, captured the city, and the revolutionaries were on their way to capture the rest of the province. Once the imperial government found out what was going on in their Hubei province, their response was, understandably, to do everything in their power to absolutely annihilate these revolutionaries. The Minister of War, Yin Chang, coordinated the counterattack on Wuhan with 2 divisions of the Beiyang army. In Beijing, the Qing, and especially Prince Chun, regent to 5-year-old Emperor Puyi, was about to swallow his pride. The Beiyang army needed a competent general that was known by senior officers and respected by his troops. Yuan Shikai was that person. He had led the Beiyang army for years and served the Qing dynasty for decades. It just so happened to be Prince Chun forced Yuan into retirement 2 years before, and Yuan still held a grudge against the Qing because of it. While he held a grudge, he was an excellent negotiator, and unbeknownst to the Qing, he was highly ambitious. For now, he waited, but when he finally gave in, he would come to power on his own terms. 10 days after the Hubei military government was proclaimed in both Shaanxi and Hunan province, the new army mutinied. Massacres against the Manchu population took place and Qing commanders were killed. The members of the Provincial Assembly for the provinces explicitly voiced their support for the revolution. The uprising now spread over China at a fast pace. In Shaanxi, the governor and his family were killed. In the southwest, in Yunnan, and southeast, in Jiangxi, students, teachers, and merchants joined the army officers in revolt, declaring their independence from the Qing as well. The Tongmenghui took the central leading role upon itself in 3 provinces and formed anti-Qing alliances in many other provinces. Now that more provinces were swept by revolts, the military significance of railways became apparent. Troops from Beijing were sent to Wuhan only to be cut off by rebellions from Jiangxi. The supply lines of Yingchang's army were blocked, and other senior commanders in the north started defying Qing orders. Instead of moving their troops south by rail, these commanders now met up and sent a telegram to Beijing containing 12 demands. The demands ranged from a functioning parliament and an elected prime minister, ratified by the emperor, to amnesty for all political offenders and blocking Manchus from official positions. As outrageous as these demands seem, the fact that Qing agreed to them within a week shows the dire situation the dynasty was in. During this time, Yuan was still negotiating both publicly and secretly on various levels. The Qing appointed him as the commander of all Qing forces. He was backed by most senior military commanders, enjoyed the loyalty of many troops, and on November 8, 1911, he was elected Prime Minister of China by members of the Beijing Provisional National Assembly. He was now to form a cabinet, which he did, primarily appointing his loyalists. It seemed that China was moving towards a constitutional monarchy, just like Russia and Japan had. The entire month of November, Yuan Shikai played a political game, pressuring both the revolutionaries and the Qing, attempting to get the most profit out of the whole situation. The Tongmenghui of Sun Yat-sen enjoyed an enormous amount of support among the Chinese. Nanking was captured by the revolutionaries in early December. It was the second biggest city of China and the former capital. The symbolic defeat was crushing to the already weak Qing. It was reminiscent of Prince Fu's defeat in 1645 and, of course, the capture of the city by Taiping rebels under Yuan in 1853. In Nanking, the Tongmenghui set up its provisional government. In the meantime, Yuan negotiated primarily with Prince Chun, regent of Puyi, and his consorts. Then, in December, the mother of Puyi took a leading role in the negotiations. She pushed the resignation of Prince Chun and authorized Yuan Shikai to rule as prime minister, with the emperor, her son Puyi, only retaining a ceremonial role. It was reminiscent of the role Empress Dowager Cixi had allocated to herself the past decades, and thus not very popular. Several victories of Yuan's troops over the revolutionaries followed, but he realized that with the suppression of the revolution, his usefulness to the Qing would again fade. On Christmas Day 1911, Sun Yat-sen arrived in Shanghai. Arriving at the provisional government in Nanjing, Sun was just in time to be elected provisional president of the Chinese Republic by delegates from 16 provincial assemblies. On New Year's Day 1912, he assumed office and the new Republic of China was born. It meant China now had both a Manchu emperor in Beijing and a Republican president in Nanjing, a situation that definitely could not go on for long. Sun realized he needed an army to consolidate his power. A charismatic man with a keen eye for political moves, he sent Yuan Shikai a telegram stating he only accepted the provisional presidency, so Yuan could later on assume the official presidency, as long as he would support the new republic. All the while, Yuan had been playing both sides of the conflict, and he now realized choosing the revolutionary side was probably going to be the most advantageous to him. As such, Yuan was willing to work with Sun, but indeed only if he could assume the presidency. He spent the next couple of weeks negotiating, both secretly and publicly, with both the provisional government in Nanjing and the imperial government in Beijing. Late January 1912, 44 senior commanders of the Beiyang army serving under Yuan Shikai sent a telegram to Beijing, urging them to create a republic. The Qing's mandate of heaven had now truly waned. Southern China had basically seceded, and Yuan Shikai now attempted to convince Puyi's regents that abdication was the only option left on the table. Some Manchu princes fled to Manchuria to lead the resistance, but the emperor's mother negotiated with Yuan. She managed to receive reassurance that Puyi could reside in the Forbidden City with his servants for years to come, and a generous stipend, to say the least. Puyi, China's last emperor, abdicated on the 12th of February 1912. The Qing dynasty, the ancient monarchy and Chinese empire, had officially come to an end. Yuan Shikai was granted full powers to organize a provisional republican government. Sun Yat-sen, staying true to his word, abdicated in favor of Yuan one day later. The deal was that Yuan would travel to Nanjing to set up his government, but unrest broke out in Beijing, which allowed Yuan to remain in Beijing in order to keep control. It is near certain Yuan had something to do with these episodes of unrest, and as such, ominously, Yuan Shikai was sworn in Beijing, the imperial capital, not Nanjing, the republican capital. He was to have supreme power with loyalists appointed at crucial positions in China's military and bureaucracy. A parliament was to be elected and full constitutional government was going to be established. As time went on, however, it became clear that Yuan Shikai had other plans when it came to both his own position and China as a whole. In 1912, after decades of hardships and an erosion of their mandate of heaven, the Qing dynasty finally collapsed. After a brief period where Dr. Sun Yat-sen was China's first president, Yuan Shikai overtook this post and started his tenure. He prevented an all-out civil war but was to betray the revolutionaries later on. If you want to know how China and the Qing dynasty got up to this point, with all revolutions, rebellions, wars and political intrigues, consider checking out the playlist on the screen, detailing the collapse of the Qing dynasty from the Opium Wars all the way up to this point. Next week will be the last chronological episode in this series. It covers the decline of the Republic into a period of warlordism. Feudal lords, often having served under Yuan Shikai, were now fighting for influence in their respective provinces. This warlord era is a fascinating yet often forgotten period. I am certainly looking forward to it. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. On the 12th of February, 1912, China's last emperor Puyi abdicated. China now commenced into uncharted political territory and became a republic. One day after Puyi's abdication, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, provisional president of the Chinese Republic, abdicated in favor of General Yuan Shikai, given that he'd respect the Chinese Republic. Yuan Shikai had other plans, however, among which eventually reinstating the monarchy, not for nostalgic and sentimental reasons though, no. He himself would be the emperor of China. Once Yuan Shikai was inaugurated as president, one of his first acts was to acknowledge the independence of Eastern Mongolia and Tibet. Both had declared their independence once Puyi had abdicated. As a result, Yuan's regime earned international recognition. Japan had come into contact with Yuan back in 1885 when he was China's viceroy in Korea. They were well aware of Yuan's antics and were the most reluctant of international powers. After some pressure, they eventually caved in anyway. The Republic of China under President Yuan Shikai was now internationally recognized. One of the first problems that presented itself to the new republic were its state finances. They were in disarray. The Beijing treasury was depleted and provinces barely paid their taxes. Against extremely unfavorable terms, Yuan managed to receive a reorganization loan from the International Consortium, a group of international bankers that also issued the loans back when the Qing wanted to nationalize railways. In short, the Republic of China immediately became dependent upon foreign loans and capital. Now, as for the governmental institutions of China, drastic reform was required. A council was tasked with ensuring the establishment of a healthy Chinese democracy. A provisional constitution was drafted in March of 1912 and procedures were designed to ensure the formation of a legitimate government. On April 5th, it was voted to move the provisional government to Beijing from Nanjing, which had been the revolutionary capital. China was now officially, for the first time, a real united republic. It now began preparing for their first ever national elections, which would be held in December that year. Only about 40 million men were allowed to vote, a mere 10% of the population. Women, illiterates, those that were bankrupt, and opium smokers were some of the groups excluded from voting rights. Considering the establishment of democratic institutions, Dr. Sun Yat-sen figured his revolutionary alliance, the Tongzhi, was ripe to transform into a party that was able to participate in a democracy. In August, the Tongzhi transformed into the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen became its chairman and Song Jiuren its prime minister, tasked with its organization. Sung, just 30 years old, was adamant about ensuring the protection of the rights of parliament and the limiting of the president's powers. The situation had it that Yuan Shikai dominated the provisional cabinet, as he had merely appointed loyalists and confidants. As the December election came closer, it was clear the Kuomintang enjoyed mass support over their three main rivals, the Progressive Party, headed by Liang Qichao, famous for his role during China's 100 Days Reform, the Republican Party, and the Unification Party. These parties were three of the main contestants. In total, there were over 300 parties that had a chance to receive at least a seat in parliament. In his struggle to maintain his power, Yuan resorted to bribery, military force, assassinations, coerced the parliament, revised the constitution, and eventually, he would even attempt to revive the monarchy. For now, as December rolled along, China's first ever democratic elections were held. It was an incredible success for the Kuomintang, winning 269 out of the 596 seats in the lower house and 123 of the 274 Senate seats. It meant the Kuomintang now had a strong mandate to push for the election of a president and a dominant role in establishing the cabinet. The members of parliament that were elected now made their way to Beijing. to start fulfilling their posts. Tongzhi, overjoyed with the success of his party, took the train to Beijing from Shanghai. About to board a train, waiting on the platform, a man walked up to Song and shot him twice. It was the 20th of March. Song would die 2 days later, 2 weeks before his 31st birthday, and a few days before he was expected to be elected as China's prime minister. It is widely believed Yuan Shikai was the chief orchestrator of the assassination, but all those that were either implicated or investigating the assassination were themselves murdered or simply disappeared. Yuan never faced justice for ordering the assassination. In fact, a traditionally anti-Qing revolutionist weapon, Yuan Shikai now adopted assassination as a way to remain in power. He had already ordered various assassinations on pro-revolutionist generals. He gave a signal to all of China: the power holder is above the law. After Song's murder, the Kuomintang delegates that did assemble in parliament quickly attempted to curb Yuan's influence by developing a permanent constitution and demanding a new, open presidential election. National finances were another issue. The unfavorable loan by the consortium was heavily criticized. It seemed he was mortgaging China's revenues to foreigners. Borrowing 21 million pounds sterling from the six-power consortium of Western powers, China would have to repay with interest until 1960, amounting over triple the amount borrowed. Feeling the heat, Yuan Shikai used bribes to buy off Kuomintang legislators in parliament. Those that refused to rescind their seats were soon visited and harassed by the police and military. Kuomintang military governors were dismissed in southern provinces during May. Southern provinces rose up against Yuan and declared their independence, but they were no match for Yuan's professional army and senior commanders. The rebellion was swiftly crushed. Within 2 months, Nanjing was captured by the reactionary general Zhang Jun. He would in later years attempt to put Puyi on the throne again. On October 6, Yuan Shikai was elected president after strong-arming the parliament into voting for him. It took 3 ballots to get a majority, but yeah, there wasn't really anything parliament could do to oppose him at this point. Once elected, Yuan marked the Kuomintang as a seditious organization and ordered it to be dissolved. Soon, Wang and other Kuomintang members fled to Japan, their dreams of a Chinese republic in shambles. In January 1914, in true autocratic fashion, Yuan dissolved parliament. Within a month, the provisional assemblies and local government organizations were dissolved as well. His cabinet resigned shortly after. Yuan was now officially China's dictator. Yuan now had to legitimize his dictatorial reign. On May 1, 1914, a constitutional compact drafted by 66 men from the cabinet replaced the constitution. Yuan now had unlimited power over war, finance, foreign policy, and citizens' rights. He relied on loans, as his annual income through taxes was only 2 million yen, whereas the Qing annual income was 260. He ran a deficit of 13 million every month. Yuan attempted to push through several reforms nevertheless. Using overpaid and underused foreign advisors, he hired a foreign policy expert, railway specialist, military attaché, and jurist. He wanted to establish an independent judiciary. Ironic, considering he just subverted the constitution. Basically, in all these sectors, Yuan had big, ambitious plans. They were a bit unrealistic as well, considering the circumstances. Still, in 1914, the First World War broke out in Europe. This bloody slaughter couldn't have come at a better time for Yuan. Without foreign interference, Yuan figured he'd be able to cement his position as China's autocrat. European powers were preoccupied in Europe, but one nation was motivated as ever to get involved in China. The Japanese, formerly allied with Britain since 1902, declared war on Germany in August 1914 and started to occupy the German concession in China. It was time to execute its design and expand influence in China. The so-called 21 demands were presented to Yuan. Japan wanted even more economic rights, joint control of China's iron and coal works, and China to permit Japanese military and police in northern China. Yuan was very aware of China's military inferiority and tried to modify some conditions, but yielded nonetheless. It wasn't worth the fight. His hands were tied. Before the demands could be implemented, however, its content was leaked to Chinese press. Anti-Japanese and anti-Yuan nationalism swept China. Once again, provinces started declaring their independence, disgruntled with Yuan so willing to capitulate to Japanese demands. As opposition grew louder, so did Yuan's crackdowns against the opposition. Newspapers were censored and forced to run articles glorifying Yuan. Perhaps in order to polish his prestige, rumors were spread. Many people actually wanted Yuan to reinstate the monarchy. After some appropriate hesitation on Yuan's side, in December 1915, a representative assembly voted, allegedly unanimously, in favor of Yuan to become emperor. All 1,993 of them. It would not last for long. Foreign observers and advisors figured the Chinese yearned for a central figure of power, but it was a miscalculation. The backlash was enormous. Barely anyone was eager to welcome a new imperial dynasty. Officers, allies, officials, and his military protégés abandoned him en masse. Once again, massive protests swept the country and provinces started declaring their independence. Yuan declared he'd reverse the monarchy, but Western support he was hoping for was not forthcoming, and his prestige was in shambles. He died on June 16, 1916, at the age of 56, a broken man. Rumors that he was poisoned last to this day. The 21 demands by Japan were not instated, nor did Yuan manage to establish his empire. Li Wanhong, who reluctantly became the face of the Wuhan Revolutionaries, now, once again reluctantly, accepted the defamed position of president. His future as president was not bright, however. It didn't take long for China to deteriorate into political chaos. Regional military chieftains known as warlords led their respective provincial armies into battle against each other. Back in 1911, revolutionaries without an army, but with a party, did not manage to consolidate their power. During the warlord era between 1916 and 28, warlords with armies but no parties proved equally ineffective. It goes without saying this period was pushing to the limits the amount of suffering the Chinese population could take. Within a year of Li Wanhong becoming president, a military coup occurred. Zhang Jun served as the field marshal under Li, yet in June 1917 he seized Beijing and declared the restoration of the Qing dynasty under Puyi, now an 11-year-old boy. Many civilians in Beijing, including Kang Youwei, who resided there, hurried to the Forbidden City to serve the new emperor. Within a month, however, Beijing was sieged by rival warlords and Zhang Jun was defeated. He fled to the Dutch legation, leaving Chinese politics for good. Puyi remained in the Forbidden City until 1924. Considering the coup was suppressed by other warlords, any credibility the central government had evaporated, and the next decade was tainted by feuding warlords. Often from extremely varying backgrounds, they had several overlapping characteristics. Primarily, most had a strong personality and a loyal subordinate force of soldiers and officers. That didn't mean their characters didn't vary widely. Some were former bandits, others were educated men attempting to instill a sense of morality on their troops. Jiangxi's warlord Yan Xizhan stated he had created the perfect ideology to run his province, which was supported by the fact he was one of the longest-sitting warlords until 1949. At any rate, often a large city was subjected to paying tax and ensuring these soldiers were fed. They were not the protectors of local civilians, but were an absolute terror. Secondly, throughout the political chaos, these warlords often sought support from Chinese institutions. This meant seeking appointments to official ranks, seats, and documents signed by civil officials. They needed the support of civilian politicians and government. The discrepancy and their power resulted from the modern technological and military capabilities, such as steamboats, railways, and certain guns, in combination with political institutions that had not even existed for a decade. Lastly, the nature of warlords and their politics was extremely confusing to nearly everyone. Sudden shifts in alliance and treason was not uncommon. All warlords attempted to increase their political power whilst acknowledging the existence of the Chinese state. There were three warlords that stood out, not indebted to Yuan Shikai for their early careers. Two of them often teamed up on the third, double-crossing each other multiple times. The first was Chang Tso-ling, the warlord of Manchuria. A bandit earlier in life, he allied with Japan against Russia in 1905 and had been Mukden's military governor ever since. The second was Wu Peifu, educated in the Confucian classics by Japanese officers. British and Chinese often publicly supported him, as I figured he was the best bet for peace and stability in China. The third was Feng Yusheng, originally a peasant. This large man was converted to Protestantism, which earned him the nickname Christian General. His troops were extremely well disciplined, and he had the habit to bless his troops before going into battle. He fought under Wu Peifu's command at first, only to betray the Beiyang warlords in 1924 by launching a coup that broke their power. There were many more warlords. To give you an idea, between 1922 and 26 there were 6 wars between provinces. Official casualties have not been recorded, but the systematic pillaging, taxation, and slaughter obviously caused incredible suffering upon the Chinese population. Under Premier and warlord Zhuang Quri, China entered World War I on the Allied side, under pretense that if Germany was defeated, the German concessions in Shandong, among other places, would be returned. Imagine the surprise of China's delegation, and country as a whole, when they were told at the conference of the Versailles Treaty that German concessions were to be given to Japan. Several more disadvantageous treaties had been signed behind the back of most Chinese, granting the Japanese more influence on the mainland. During this warlord chaos, Sun Yat-sen managed to return to China. In 1917, he arrived in Canton and for the next years played a visible but inconclusive role in Chinese politics. Looking back at his political career, he too must have realized China seemed much weaker and more divided than it would have been under the Qing. It is testament to his tenacity and perseverance that he continued his struggle and followed the dream he had envisioned for China. The betrayal of the Versailles Treaty sparked a new generation of nationalists and anti-Western sentiment. These would struggle for a better China the coming decades, often taking very different political approaches. I feel this is a good time to wrap up this documentary series about the fall of the Qing dynasty over 70 years of Chinese wars, rebellions, upheavals, and reforms. We have come to an end of this documentary about the downfall of the Qing dynasty. Reading about the last decades of the Qing dynasty has been captivating, interesting, frustrating at times, but never has it been boring or a chore. I could go on and extend this documentary to the power struggle within the Kuomintang after Sun's death, the rise of China's Communist Party and Mao Zedong, the ensuing civil war, Japan occupying China in World War II, or even the civil war after World War II, once again between the communists and the nationalists, all the way up to the communist victory in 1949, and perhaps even further than that. I could, and perhaps I will. For now, I have over 80 pages of script and over 130 pages of notes pertaining to this documentary series. If you have watched it up to this point, over 2 hours of footage in total, I hope you learned a bit and found it interesting. It has been an incredible joy to work on this. Hundreds of hours were spent, and I don't think I could have spent them any better. Thank you for watching. I am humbled by the positive response this project has received, and I am planning on creating many more in-depth documentaries such as this one. I am already working on one, and for the next 2 months, uploading will remain as usual at 2 videos per week. If you have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.